Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about the French court, but not the pretty version you often imagine. Forget the romanticized myths of elegant dances and whispered sweet nothings. No, we're diving deep into the true grit, the raw ambition, the opulent decay, and the utterly human, often brutal secrets hidden beneath layers of silk and powdered wigs. This wasn't some fairy tale. It was a ruthless battlefield where reputation was currency and a single wrong step could mean social ruin or worse. It was a world of unimaginable excess built upon unseen suffering, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with desire and dread. As you settle in, remember this isn't just history, it's a visceral experience. Before we really begin, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and comment below with your location and current time. Now dim the lights, find that cozy spot, and let's journey back to a time when splendor hid shadows. Imagine, if you will, that you've just arrived at Versailles. You've journeyed for days, perhaps weeks, your coach rattling over cobbled roads, the scent of horse and dust clinging to your clothes. You've heard the tales, seen the engravings, dreamt of the Sun King's palace. And now, as the vast, sprawling edifice slowly materializes on the horizon, gilded by the setting sun, your breath catches. It's magnificent, monumental, a dizzying display of human ambition and artistry. The sheer scale of it, the endless rows of windows glittering like eyes, the perfectly manicured gardens stretching into infinity. It's overwhelming, a testament to absolute power. You feel a thrill, a mixture of awe and trepidation, as you realize you're about to step into the very heart of this dazzling, dangerous world. But let's strip away the romantic filters your modern mind applies. As your carriage finally clatters through the gates, you don't just smell the exquisite perfumes of the aristocracy or the fragrant blooms of the parterres. No, the first thing that truly assails your senses is a complex, almost shocking miasma. Beneath the heady top notes of rose and jasmine worn by passing courtiers, there's a distinct undertone of human waste. The palace, for all its golden grandeur, lacked basic modern sanitation. You would catch whiffs of urine from stairwells, of excrement from behind tapestries, where courtiers, unable to endure the long walk to distant latrines or simply too impatient, relieved themselves in alcoves and corridors. You'd smell the stale sweat of hundreds, thousands of bodies crammed into spaces, their silk and velvet finery doing little to mask the reality of infrequent bathing. Remember, a daily bath for most was an alien concept. Perhaps once a month, if you were fastidious, a sponge bath might suffice. The concept of deodorants? A fantasy. So the air is thick, a heavy blend of expensive perfumes trying desperately, and often failing, to conquer the pervasive stench of humanity. As you step down from your carriage, perhaps an attendant, a liveried lackey, guides you through a side entrance into a bustling antechamber. The sounds hit you next. It's not the quiet dignity you might expect from a royal residence. Instead, it's a constant cacophonous hum. The rustle of silks and brocades, the clatter of hundreds of heels on polished marble, the murmur of countless conversations, some hushed and conspiratorial, others loud and boisterous. There's the distant strain of a harpsichord, perhaps a violin, but also the sharp bark of a dog, the shouts of servants, the rhythmic clang of a nearby forge if you venture too close to the service wings. And everywhere you hear whispers. They are the true currency of Versailles, carrying reputations, fortunes, and even lives on their fleeting breaths. You realize instantly that every ear is open, every glance is measured, every word is weighed. Visually, it's a feast and a nightmare. The sheer opulence is undeniable. You see ceilings painted with epic allegories, gilded panels that gleam like solid gold, mirrors that reflect the overwhelming spectacle in 1,000 dizzying angles. But look closer, allow your modern eyes to pierce the glamour. The tapestries, though magnificent, are often faded, stained by age and less than careful handling. The polished marble floors are worn in places, chipped, sometimes even slick with a spilled drink, or worse. The heavy velvet curtains, while rich, are thick with dust.
And the people, oh, the people.
You see gentlemen in lace and brocade, their wigs towering, powdered white as snow, their faces painted, lips rouged. Ladies in gowns of impossible dimensions, stiff with whalebone and silk, their hair an architectural marvel, adorned with pearls, ribbons, even miniature ships or gardens. But beneath the powder you might spot a pock-marked complexion, a tired eye, a desperate glint of ambition. You'd see the subtle shift in a man's stance when a higher-ranking noble passes, the forced smile on a lady's face as she endures a tedious conversation, the frantic scramble of a junior courtier trying to catch the eye of someone important. Privacy?
As you understand, it simply doesn't exist.
You, a modern person accustomed to your own space, your own bathroom, your own quiet moments, would find yourself in a state of constant surveillance. From the moment you rise, if you were lucky enough to have a small chamber to yourself, your servants would be there, helping you dress, groom, ready for the day. And once you step out, you are never alone. The corridors are perpetually crowded.
Even the most intimate moments of the king's life.
His lever, waking up, and coucher, going to bed, were elaborate public spectacles attended by dozens, sometimes hundreds,
of the most privileged courtiers.
Imagine trying to conduct your personal life with an audience. Your breakfast would be served in a shared dining hall, your conversations overheard, your every move watched. Every smile, every frown, every interaction would be scrutinized, interpreted, and immediately become fodder for the ceaseless gossip machine that powered the court. This relentless exposure would be exhausting, a constant performance where failure to impress meant falling out of favor, and falling out of favor meant ruin. And let's talk about food. You, from your world of readily available, hygienically prepared meals, would find the courtly dining a strange beast. The feasts were legendary, piled high with exotic meats, sugary confections, and rivers of wine. But the preparation?
Often less than sanitary.
Food was handled by many hands, served lukewarm, and often left to sit for hours. You might see a pampered lapdog nibbling at scraps on the floor, or rats scurrying in the periphery of the kitchens. Digestive ailments were common, a constant companion to the rich, heavy diet.
And the waste.
Mountains of food, untouched or half-eaten, would be thrown out, a stark contrast to the starving populace just outside the palace gates. The excess was not just about showing wealth. It was a deliberate, performative act of consumption, a statement of power that mocked the very idea of scarcity. Now think about the cold. Versailles, for all its grandeur, was notoriously draughty and difficult to heat. In the depths of winter, despite the roaring fires in countless hearths, the vast high-ceilinged rooms would remain bone-chillingly cold. You'd see courtiers huddled in fur-lined cloaks, their breath misting as they conversed. The delicate silks and velvets that looked so grand in portraits provided little warmth. You'd wake with teeth chattering, and perhaps even shiver through formal ceremonies, your body aching from the damp chill that seeped into the very stone of the palace. Your modern thermostat, your insulated home, these are luxuries that you take for granted. But here, in the heart of French power, comfort was a fleeting guest. The lack of control over your environment, the constant assault on your senses, the perpetual performance demanded by court life, these are the subtle horrors that lie beneath the gilded surface. You're not just an observer here. You are a participant caught in a web where the rules are unwritten but absolute. Every glance from the king, every polite word from a duke, every snicker from a rival marquise carries immense weight. Your position, your family's honor, your very future, all depend on navigating this treacherous landscape. This golden cage isn't just a metaphor for the king's absolute power. It's a description of your own experience. You are trapped within its splendor, constantly aware that your every move is being judged, that your very existence here is a privilege that can be revoked at any moment. And as you try to sleep in your uncomfortable,
often shared, bed, the constant creak of floorboards,
the distant laughter, the scratch of rats in the walls, would remind you that even the night offers little respite in this magnificent, suffocating world. You'd yearn for the quiet solitude, the simple hygiene, the personal space of your own time, a longing that would gnaw at you, even as the glittering spectacle of Versailles continued to unfold around you. The true secret of this court, you realize, is not just its power or its sins, but its utter strangeness, its brutal reality, and the constant, relentless pressure it exerts on every soul within its walls. You've survived your initial shock at the sensory overload of Versailles, perhaps even begun to acclimatize to the constant hum of life in the palace. Now let's bring you closer to the true beating heart of this world. The King. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was not merely a monarch. He was the center of the universe, a living embodiment of the state around whom everything revolved. And his chambers, his private apartments, were the absolute epicenter of power, the very sanctum where destinies were made and unmade. Getting into these chambers, being present during his most personal rituals, was the ultimate sign of favor, a social climb that consumed the lives of thousands. Imagine for a moment the deep, guttural yearning for recognition. For status, that drove every noble at court. For you in your modern world, status might come from wealth, career success, or even social media influence. But in 17th century Versailles, status was directly proportional to your physical proximity to the king. The closer you were, the more intimately involved in his daily life, the more powerful you were perceived to be. This wasn't about friendship or genuine affection. It was about the brutal mechanics of power. To be allowed into the king's lever, his formal waking up ceremony, was an honor beyond measure, a testament to your family's lineage, your unwavering loyalty, or your cunning political maneuvering. You would rise before dawn, roused by your valets in the dim, freezing light of your own small apartment. The air would be sharp and cold, condensation on the inside of the window panes. Your teeth would chatter as your servants helped you don the layers of your court attire, the heavy silks, the elaborate lace cravat, the powdered wig that felt both itchy and suffocating. You'd check your appearance in a small, often dim, mirror, adjusting your sword hilt, ensuring your ribbons were perfectly tied. The journey from your apartment to the king's bedchamber would be a frantic, silent dash through labyrinthine corridors, perhaps jostling with other ambitious courtiers, all striving for the same precious spots. When you finally reached the king's antechamber, the first of many rooms leading to his actual bedchamber, the atmosphere would be palpable, a hushed tension, a collective breath held. Here, dozens of nobles, some amongst the highest in the land, would already be gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of anticipation and fatigue. They would stand, motionless, perhaps exchanging only the briefest, most formal greetings. You'd feel the raw ambition radiating off them, a silent hum of competition. The air, though cleaner than in the main halls, would still carry the scent of perfume, candle wax, and the metallic tang of anxiety. You would be acutely aware of your own heart pounding, the slight tremor in your hands, knowing that a single misstep, a clumsy word, could shatter your carefully constructed facade. Then, the doors to the king's great chamber would swing open, and a privileged few, the grands entrees, would be admitted. If you were truly favored, if your family held ancient titles, you might be among them. You'd step inside into a room that even in the grey dawn shimmered with gold and rich fabrics. The king, a figure of immense gravity and presence, would still be in his bed, the heavy velvet curtains drawn around him. The first valet de chambre would slowly, ceremoniously part the curtains. And there he would be, the Sun King, just stirring from sleep. This wasn't a private awakening. This was theatre, meticulously choreographed, designed to project an image of divine authority and unyielding power. You'd witness the first valet hand him his holy water, then assist him in putting on his slippers and dressing gown. Then, in a series of highly ritualized steps, more courtiers would be admitted. The entrée de la chambre, then the entrée de la garde-robe, and finally the grandes entrées. Each stage allowed a new circle of people to witness the monarch's gradual ascent from slumber to fully dressed ruler. You'd watch as his shirt was presented to him, often by his son or brother, a task of immense symbolic weight. His breeches, his stockings, his embroidered waistcoat, his sword, each item of clothing was offered and accepted with a solemnity usually reserved for religious rites. During all this, the king would often conduct business. He might discuss matters of state with his ministers, receive petitions, or simply exchange a few terse words with a favored courtier.
You standing there would strain to catch every word, every nuance, every flicker of emotion on his face. Was he pleased?
Was he annoyed?
Who was he looking at?
Every gesture was laden with meaning. You'd feel the sheer, suffocating weight of his presence, the way his gaze could feel like a physical touch piercing through you, your own discomfort, the stiffness in your back, the ache in your feet from standing for so long, would be utterly secondary to the immense privilege of being there, a silent witness to the daily genesis of absolute power. This ritual wasn't just about showing off. It was a carefully constructed system of control. By involving so many nobles in his most personal moments, Louis XIV kept them occupied, competing for his attention rather than plotting against him.
It fostered a pervasive paranoia.
Who was up?
Who was down?
Who caught the king's eye? Who was ignored? You'd feel this paranoia in the air, a silent predator stalking the corridors, turning allies into rivals, and turning rivals into mortal enemies. You'd learn to read the subtle signs, the king's slight nod, the way he turned his shoulder, the exact placement of a noble in the procession. These were not minor details. They were portents, whispered omens of a courtier's rise or fall. And what about the whispers? They were everywhere. As the king completed his lever, moving to the mass, then to his council meetings, the courtiers would disperse, and the whispers would erupt anew. Did you see who presented his wig? Did you hear what he said to Monsieur le Duc? The king frowned when Madame de So-and-so spoke. Every gesture, every word, every absence from a particular ceremony would be dissected, analyzed, and used to predict the shifting tides of royal favor. You'd quickly learn that silence was often safer than speech, but invisibility was death. You had to be seen, to be present, but never to offend. It was a tightrope walk across a chasm of social ruin. The constant jockeying for position, the subtle slights, the overt displays of status. These were the sinews of the court. You might see two noblemen, outwardly polite, but their eyes would betray a cold animosity born of generations of rivalry for land, title, or the king's ear. Duels, though outlawed, still occurred in hidden corners, driven by insults to honor that could be as minor as a perceived slight in a courtly procession. The threat of violence, both physical and social, was always present, lurking beneath the polished veneer of courtly manners. This intense environment bred an almost neurotic obsession with appearances. Your clothing, your comportment, your command of courtly language, even your ability to dance or play a musical instrument, all were tools in the relentless pursuit of royal favor. You would spend vast sums on your wardrobe, often bankrupting your estates to keep up with the latest fashions, because to appear less than your station demanded was to invite contempt. You'd practice your bows, your curtsies, your elegant turns of phrase, knowing that a single clumsy movement or an ill-chosen word could brand you as a provincial oaf, unworthy of the Sun King's august presence. Ultimately, your presence in the king's chambers, in his very presence, was a daily reminder of your own precariousness and of the absolute terrifying power he wielded. He was the source of all grace, all honor, all wealth. And his displeasure could mean your banishment from court, the forfeiture of your titles, the ruin of your family. You'd feel the subtle tremors of fear that ran through the court, a collective understanding that life here was a constant gamble. This absolute power, this relentless focus on the monarch, was both the glory and the great underlying sin of the French court, a system that elevated one man to divine status, draining the vitality and independence from thousands of his most powerful subjects, forcing them into a gilded cage of obedience and anxiety, where every whisper carried the weight of destiny. And as you finally left the king's formal presence, the cold morning air hitting you again, you'd feel the immense relief, mixed with the gnawing worry of whether you had done enough, said enough, or simply been seen enough to secure your place for another day in this glittering, terrifying pantomime. You've witnessed the formal mechanics of power in the king's chambers, the rigid rituals designed to reinforce his absolute authority. But now let's pull back the velvet curtains on an even more fascinating and often far more influential aspect of court life: the king's mistresses. These women were not mere objects of affection. They were forces of nature, wielding a soft, potent power that could rival that of the highest ministers, shape policy, and even determine the fates of entire noble families. For you, a modern individual, the concept of a king openly maintaining a mistress, often with the queen's reluctant acceptance, might seem scandalous. But at the French court, it was a recognized, almost institutionalized element of power. Imagine the queen, Marie-Thérèse, a pious, quiet woman, often overlooked and overshadowed. She understood her role to provide an heir, to embody piety, and to endure the king's numerous infidelities with a stoic grace. She was a necessary fixture, a symbol, but the real emotional and often political intimacy often lay elsewhere. And you, observing this, would quickly grasp that the path to the king's ear sometimes led directly through his latest favorite. Let's focus first on Madame de Montespan, Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart.
Imagine her, a woman of dazzling beauty, fiery intellect, and formidable ambition.
She arrives at court already married, a lady-in-waiting to the queen. But her allure is undeniable, her wit sharp, her presence commanding. Louis XIV, a man of immense appetites and a firm belief in his own divine right, sees her and desires her. And what the king desires, the king takes. You would witness her rise, a meteoric ascent that would leave a trail of broken hearts and furious rivals in its wake. Her seduction of the king wasn't a sudden event. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign. She employed her charms, her intelligence, her biting wit to capture his attention. She made herself indispensable not just as a lover, but as a conversationalist, someone who could challenge him, amuse him, and understand his complex mind. As her star rose, you'd see the subtle shifts in court dynamics. Courtiers would gravitate towards her salon, hoping to catch her eye, to gain her favor. Her family, the proud house of Mortemart, would suddenly find themselves showered with honors, titles, and lucrative positions. This was the overt mechanism of power through the king's left hand. You would rise before dawn, roused by your valets in the dim, freezing light of your own small apartment. The air would be sharp and cold, condensation on the inside of the window panes. Your teeth would chatter as your servants helped you don the layers of your court attire, the heavy silks, the elaborate lace cravat, the powdered wig that felt both itchy and suffocating. You check your appearance in a small, often dim mirror, adjusting your sword hilt, ensuring your ribbons were perfectly tied. The journey from your apartment to the king's bedchamber would be a frantic, silent dash through labyrinthine corridors, perhaps jostling with other ambitious courtiers, all striving for the same precious spots. When you finally reached the king's antechamber, the first of many rooms leading to his actual bedchamber, The atmosphere would be palpable. A hushed tension, a collective breath held. Here, dozens of nobles, some amongst the highest in the land, would already be gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of anticipation and fatigue. They would stand motionless, perhaps exchanging only the briefest, most formal greetings. You'd feel the raw ambition radiating off them, a silent hum of competition. The air, though cleaner than in the main halls, would still carry the scent of perfume, candle wax, and the metallic tang of anxiety. You would be acutely aware of your own heart pounding, the slight tremor in your hands, knowing that a single misstep, a clumsy word, could shatter your carefully constructed facade. Then, the doors to the king's great chamber would swing open, and a privileged few, the grands entrées, would be admitted. If you were truly favored, if your family held ancient titles, you might be among them. You'd step inside, into a room that even in the grey dawn shimmered with gold and rich fabrics. The king, a figure of immense gravity and presence, would still be in his bed, the heavy velvet curtains drawn around him. The first valet de chambre would slowly, ceremoniously, part the curtains. And there he would be, the Sun King, just stirring from sleep. This wasn't a private awakening. This was theatre, meticulously choreographed, designed to project an image of divine authority and unyielding power. You'd witness the first valet hand him his holy water, then assist him in putting on his slippers and dressing gown. Then, in a series of highly ritualized steps, more courtiers would be admitted. The entrée de la chambre, then the entrée de la garde-robe, and finally the grande entrée. Each stage allowed a new circle of people to witness the monarch's gradual ascent from slumber to fully dressed ruler. You'd watch as his shirt was presented to him, often by his son or brother, a task of immense symbolic weight. His breeches, his stockings, his embroidered waistcoat, his sword, each item of clothing was offered and accepted with a solemnity usually reserved for religious rites. During all this, the king would often conduct business. He might discuss matters of state with his ministers, receive petitions, or simply exchange a few terse words with a favored courtier. You, standing there, would strain to catch every word, every nuance, every flicker of emotion on his face.
Was he pleased? Was he annoyed?
Who was he looking at? Every gesture was laden with meaning. You'd feel the sheer, suffocating weight of his presence, the way his gaze could feel like a physical touch, piercing through you. Your own discomfort, the stiffness in your back, the ache in your feet from standing for so long, would be utterly secondary to the immense privilege of being there, a silent witness to the daily genesis of absolute power. This ritual wasn't just about showing off. It was a carefully constructed system of control. By involving so many nobles in his most personal moments, Louis XIV kept them occupied, competing for his attention rather than plotting against him. It fostered a pervasive paranoia. Who was up? Who was down? Who caught the king's eye? Who was ignored? You'd feel this paranoia in the air, a silent predator stalking the corridors, turning allies into rivals and turning rivals into mortal enemies. You'd learn to read the subtle signs, the king's slight nod, the way he turned his shoulder, the exact placement of a noble in the procession. These were not minor details. They were portents, whispered omens of a courtier's rise or fall. And what about the whispers? They were everywhere. As the king completed his lever, moving to the mass, then to his council meetings, the courtiers would disperse, and the whispers would erupt anew. Did you see who presented his wig? Did you hear what he said to Monsieur le Duc? The king frowned when Madame de So-and-so spoke. Every gesture, every word, every absence from a particular ceremony would be dissected, analyzed, and used to predict the shifting tides of royal favor. You'd quickly learn that silence was often safer than speech, but invisibility was death. You had to be seen, to be present, but never to offend. It was a tightrope walk across a chasm of social ruin. The constant jockeying for position, the subtle slights, the overt displays of status. These were the sinews of the court. You might see two noblemen, outwardly polite, but their eyes would betray a cold animosity, born of generations of rivalry for land, title, or the king's ear. Duels, though outlawed, still occurred in hidden corners, driven by insults to honor that could be as minor as a perceived slight in a courtly procession. The threat of violence, both physical and social, was always present, lurking beneath the polished veneer of courtly manners. This intense environment bred an almost neurotic obsession with appearances. Your clothing, your comportment, your command of courtly language, even your ability to dance or play a musical instrument, all were tools in the relentless pursuit of royal favor. You would spend vast sums on your wardrobe, often bankrupting your estates to keep up with the latest fashions, because to appear less than your station demanded was to invite contempt. You'd practice your bows, your curtsies, your elegant turns of phrase, knowing that a single clumsy movement or an ill-chosen word could brand you as a provincial oaf, unworthy of the Sun King's august presence. Ultimately, your presence in the king's chambers, in his very presence, was a daily reminder of your own precariousness and of the absolute, terrifying power he wielded. He was the source of all grace, all honor, all wealth, and his displeasure could mean your banishment from court, the forfeiture of your titles, the ruin of your family. You'd feel the subtle tremors of fear that ran through the court, a collective understanding that life here was a constant gamble. This absolute power, this relentless focus on the monarch, was both the glory and the great underlying sin of the French court, a system that elevated one man to divine status, draining the vitality and independence from thousands of his most powerful subjects, forcing them into a gilded cage of obedience and anxiety, where every whisper carried the weight of destiny. And as you finally left the king's formal presence, the cold morning air hitting you again, you'd feel the immense relief, mixed with the gnawing worry of whether you had done enough, said enough, or simply been seen enough to secure your place for another day in this glittering, terrifying pantomime. You've witnessed the formal mechanics of power in the king's chambers, the rigid rituals designed to reinforce his absolute authority. But now, let's pull back the velvet curtains on an even more fascinating and often far more influential aspect of court life: the king's mistresses. These women were not mere objects of affection. They were forces of nature, wielding a soft, potent power that could rival that of the highest ministers, shape policy, and even determine the fates of entire noble families. For you, a modern individual, the concept of a king openly maintaining a mistress,
Often with the Queen's reluctant acceptance, might seem scandalous.
but at the French court, it was a recognized, almost institutionalized element of power. Imagine the Queen, Marie-Thérèse, a pious, quiet woman, often overlooked and overshadowed. She understood her role, to provide an heir, to embody piety, and to endure the king's numerous infidelities with a stoic grace. She was a necessary fixture, a symbol, but the real emotional and often political intimacy often lay elsewhere, and you observing this would quickly grasp that the path to the king's ear sometimes led directly through his latest favorite. Let's focus first on Madame de Montespan, Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemar. Imagine her, a woman of dazzling beauty, fiery intellect, and formidable ambition. She arrives at court already married, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. But her allure is undeniable, her wit sharp, her presence commanding. Louis XIV, a man of immense appetites and a firm belief in his own divine right, sees her and desires her.
And what the king desires, the king takes.
You would witness her rise, a meteoric ascent that would leave a trail of broken hearts and furious rivals in its wake. Her seduction of the king wasn't a sudden event. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign. She employed her charms, her intelligence, her biting wit to capture his attention. She made herself indispensable, not just as a lover, but as a conversationalist, someone who could challenge him, amuse him, and understand his complex mind. As her star rose, you'd see the subtle shifts in court dynamics. Courtiers would gravitate towards her salon, hoping to catch her eye, to gain her favor. Her family, the proud house of Mortemart, would suddenly find themselves showered with honors, titles, and lucrative positions. This was the overt mechanism of power through the king's left hand. Now picture the physical reality of Montespan's situation. She lives in magnificent apartments, often directly above or adjacent to the king's own. Her children with the king, who are eventually legitimized, live in their own splendid nursery, attended by a small army of governesses and servants, most notably the future Madame de Maintenon. You'd see her adorned in jewels, draped in the finest silks, her presence radiating an almost royal authority. But beneath the surface there's an immense pressure. She must constantly maintain the king's affections, battle rival courtesans, and navigate the treacherous waters of courtly jealousy. Every wrinkle, every sign of age, every perceived slight could spell her downfall. You would feel the immense burden she carries, the sheer expenditure of emotional and political energy required to maintain her position. Her power was tangible. Ministers would consult her before approaching the king. Ambassadors would seek her counsel. She would receive petitions, dispense favors, and influence appointments. You would see how a simple word from her could elevate a minor noble to a powerful position or consign a rival to disgrace and exile. She was a conduit to the Sun King, a gateway to his vast reservoir of power and patronage. Imagine the thousands of hopefuls, the ambitious parents, the desperate petitioners, all vying for a moment of her attention, a kind word, a supportive glance. The atmosphere around her would be thick with expectation, with a nervous energy that could almost be tasted. But her position was also precarious, built on the fickle foundation of royal affection. The king, after all, was Louis XIV, a man whose personal life was as much a political statement as his foreign policy. He was also deeply religious, and his lengthy affair with Montespan, especially given her married status and the public nature of their multiple children, eventually began to weigh on his conscience. You would witness the slow, agonizing decline of her influence. The church, led by figures like Bossuet, began to openly condemn the king's immoral conduct. The affair of the poisons, which implicated her in black masses and attempts to regain the king's love through sorcery, delivered a crushing blow to her reputation, even though she was never formally charged. As Montespan's star waned, another woman quietly, shrewdly, rose to prominence, Françoise d'Aubigné, Madame de Maintenon. She began as the governess to Montespan's illegitimate children with the king. You would see her at first as a quiet, pious, intelligent woman observing, learning, and slowly gaining the king's respect, not through flamboyant beauty, but through her intellect, her calm demeanor, and her genuine piety. Contrast her with Montespan's fiery passion. Maintenon offered the king something different: companionship, solace, and spiritual guidance. You'd watch as the king, growing older, more reflective, turned increasingly to Maintenon. Their conversations were not just about pleasure, but about matters of state, about his conscience, about the deeper questions of life. She became his confidant, his intellectual equal, his moral compass. The court, initially skeptical of this quiet woman, slowly began to recognize her growing influence. Ministers who once bypassed her now sought her opinion.
Nobles who once dismissed her now paid her court.
Her apartments, though less ostentatious than Montespan's had been, became a new locus of power. The ultimate sinful secret of Maintenon's story is her eventual secret marriage to Louis XIV after Queen Marie-Thérése's death. Imagine the scandal, the absolute outrage, had this been publicly known.
A woman of relatively modest birth, a governess, secretly marrying the King of France.
This was an act of profound social transgression, a direct challenge to the rigid hierarchy of blood and title that underpinned the entire system. But it was kept secret, a tacit acknowledgement of the impossibility of such a union in the public eye, even for an absolute monarch. You'd feel the immense power and vulnerability in that secret. The power of a king to defy convention for love or profound companionship, and the vulnerability of a woman who could never truly be queen, despite sharing the king's bed and confidence. The existence of royal mistresses and their profound influence reveals a fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of the French court. On one hand, there was the rigid code of honor, the outward display of Catholic piety, and the constant striving for decorum. On the other, the king, the supposed moral exemplar, openly flouted these norms. His affairs were not just tolerated, they were integrated into the political landscape, becoming alternative channels of power. This created an environment where moral flexibility was not just accepted, but often necessary for survival and advancement. You, coming from a world with clearer lines between public and private morality, would find this blend of public piety and private promiscuity utterly perplexing, yet undeniably compelling. It was a world where personal affections could sway national policy, where a whispered word in a lover's ear could alter the course of history, and where the most powerful figures were often those who mastered the delicate art of wielding influence from the king's bedchamber. The king's many hearts, you realize, were not just a matter of personal desire. They were strategic assets, and the women who captured them were players in the grandest, most dangerous game of all. You've seen the king as the absolute sun, and his mistresses as powerful planets orbiting him. Now let's zoom out to the constellations, the myriad noble families, their long histories, their deep-seated rivalries, and the constant, ruthless game they played for power, prestige, and land. This wasn't a unified court. It was a swirling maelstrom of factions, each vying for supremacy, each prepared to use any means necessary to advance its interests. For you, accustomed to democratic processes and legal frameworks, the sheer personal nature of power and conflict at Versailles would be astounding. There were no impartial referees, only the king, and his favor was as fickle as the weather. Imagine the grand halls, the opulent salons as a vast chessboard. Each noble, from the ancient dukes with their vast estates and centuries of lineage, to the newly ennobled families desperate to solidify their position, was a piece.
And the game was perpetual.
You wouldn't just see individuals here. You'd see entire family dynasties tracing their roots back to medieval times, their feuds and alliances passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. The Montmorencys against the Rohans, the Condés against the Guises. These names carried weight, representing vast networks of patronage, land holdings, and military might. The stakes were incredibly high. A family's honor, its wealth, its future, all depended on its ability to navigate this treacherous political landscape. To gain the king's favor meant lucrative appointments, pensions, land grants, and the coveted right to hold certain offices. To lose it meant humiliation, financial ruin, and perhaps even exile from the glittering center of power, a fate worse than death for many. You'd feel the immense pressure, the constant anxiety that gnawed at these individuals, hidden beneath their powdered wigs and silken smiles. Every courtier was acutely aware that their fortunes could turn on a dime, a single misstep, a misinterpreted word, or the sudden rise of a rival. Let's talk about the weapons used in this game. They weren't always swords, though duels, though outlawed by Louis XIV, still occurred in the shadows. The primary weapons were whispers, gossip, carefully placed rumors, and expertly timed public displays of loyalty or disdain. You'd see nobles subtly undermine their rivals, by praising them too effusively for an imagined virtue, implying they were foolish or naive, or by suggesting ever so delicately that a certain family's finances were not as robust as they seemed, or that a particular courtier harbored dangerous, unpatriotic ideas. These were sophisticated psychological battles fought with words and gestures, designed to erode a rival's standing in the king's eyes without ever appearing to be malicious. One of the most potent tools in this game was marriage. For you, marriage is often a matter of love and personal choice. Here, it was a strategic alliance, a merger of powerful families designed to consolidate wealth, extend influence, and secure advantageous positions at court. You'd see young men and women, often little more than children, betrothed to individuals they barely knew, their personal feelings utterly irrelevant compared to the political and financial gains their union would bring. Imagine the pressure on these individuals forced into lifelong partnerships for the benefit of their families, their own happiness a secondary concern at best. A good marriage could elevate an entire family.
A bad one could drag it down, and the finances. Oh, the finances were a constant source of anxiety and manipulation.
To maintain a presence at court, to dress appropriately, to entertain, to bribe minor officials required immense sums of money. Many noble families, despite their vast estates, were perpetually on the brink of bankruptcy, pouring every last livre into maintaining their image at Versailles. You'd see the desperate attempts to secure pensions from the king, to marry into wealthy bourgeois families, a social step down, but a financial lifeline, or to engage in speculative ventures that often ended in ruin. This constant financial strain fueled the rivalries, as each family sought to secure a larger slice of the royal patronage pie. Consider the intricate dance of social hierarchy. The concept of rank was paramount. Not all dukes were. Some held precedence over others based on the antiquity of their titles or their specific functions at court. You would quickly learn the unspoken rules: who bows to whom first, who enters a room before whom, who sits where at a royal dinner. These might seem like trivial matters to you, but they were deeply significant markers of status. To be denied a chair, to be forced to stand when others sat, was a profound insult, a public humiliation that could spark furious duels and generations of animosity. The sheer boredom of court life often exacerbated these rivalries. Without meaningful work for many of the higher nobles, their energies were channeled into social maneuvering, gossip, and petty feuds. Imagine living in a constant state of high alert, your emotions always tightly controlled, your social antennae always twitching. You'd find yourself exhausted by the relentless performance, the need to always be on, always aware of who was watching, who was listening. The only outlet for this immense pressure was often to engage in the very games that created it. Let's not forget the power of the king's family, his brothers, his sons, his cousins. These royal princes, though bound by blood, were often bitter rivals themselves, each with their own factions, their own ambitions, and their own grievances. The Duke of Orléans, Louis XIV's brother, was a flamboyant figure, often at odds with the king's policies, yet a key player in court life. Their rivalries were complex, mixing genuine affection with deep-seated resentment and competition for influence. You'd observe these intricate family dynamics, seeing how personal relationships, even within the royal family, were always intertwined with the brutal calculus of power. This system bred a profound sense of paranoia.
You couldn't fully trust anyone.
The friend you confided in one day might be the one spreading rumors about you the next. The ally you counted on might switch allegiance if a more advantageous offer came along. You'd learn to keep your true thoughts hidden, to present a carefully constructed facade to the world, never revealing your weaknesses or your deepest ambitions. This constant vigilance, this inability to truly relax or be oneself, was another heavy burden of court life. It was a golden cage, not just for the king, but for all the nobles trapped within its glittering bars, forced to play a game with unseen rules and devastating consequences. The sin here is multifaceted. It's the sin of endless ambition, untempered by genuine concern for the kingdom or its people. It's the sin of cynicism, where human relationships are reduced to transactional exchanges for power. It's the sin of idleness and boredom, which fueled so much of the destructive gossip and intrigue. And it's the sin of a system that actively encouraged this internecine warfare, believing that a divided nobility was a less threatening nobility. As you watch the elegant figures glide through the hall of mirrors, you realize that beneath the polished surface, a constant, silent battle rages, a perpetual game of thrones where the stakes are everything, and mercy is a foreign concept. And you, if you wish to survive, would have to learn to play the game too, or be crushed by its relentless machinery. You've seen the political maneuvering and the relentless pursuit of status that defined the French court. Now, let's peel back another layer, revealing the decadent underbelly, the forbidden pleasures that pulsed beneath the surface of official piety and rigid etiquette. For all its grand pronouncements on morality and the divine right of kings, Versailles was a cauldron of human desires, where gambling debts soared, sexual appetites ran wild, and private parties often dissolved into scenes of shocking depravity.
You, with your modern sensibilities,
Might think your era invented hedonism, but believe me, 17th and 18th century France could give any modern party scene a run for its money.
all behind gilded doors. Imagine the nights at Versailles.
After the king had retired, after the formal gatherings had ended, a different kind of court came alive. The chandeliers would still sparkle, but the conversations would drop to hushed tones. The laughter would become a little more unrestrained, and the pursuit of pleasure would take precedence over the pursuit of power, at least overtly. These were the moments when the strictures of court life loosened, when the masks slipped, and the true desires of the aristocracy came to the fore. Let's talk about gambling, a ubiquitous obsession that ruined countless fortunes. You'd walk into designated card rooms, often filled with a haze of candle smoke and the clatter of dice and the slap of cards. The atmosphere would be electric, charged with the thrill of risk and the despair of loss. High-ranking nobles, men and women of immense wealth and prestige, would sit for hours, sometimes days, betting astronomical sums on games of Prelon, Lansquenet, or Pharaon. Fortunes would be won and lost in a single night. Estates were mortgaged, jewels pawned, and reputations tarnished by colossal debts. You'd see the flushed faces of winners, the grim despair of losers, their hands shaking as they counted out their last coins or signed away another piece of ancestral land. This wasn't harmless entertainment. It was a destructive addiction, a financial black hole that devoured the wealth of the nobility and fueled their constant need for royal pensions and lucrative appointments. The thrill of it, the escape from the monotonous pressures of courtly performance, was too potent to resist for many. Then there were the masked balls, the quintessential expression of courtly decadence. Imagine yourself amidst hundreds of revelers, all disguised, their faces hidden behind elaborate masks. The air would be thick with music, violins, flutes, harpsichords, and the intoxicating scent of wine, perfume, and sweat. Here, the rigid hierarchy of the court could be temporarily suspended. A duke might dance with a courtesan, a marchioness might flirt with a minor gentleman, all under the anonymity of the mask. This freedom, however brief, was immensely intoxicating. It allowed for forbidden encounters, for whispered intimacies that would be impossible in the open glare of day. You'd see couples slip away into dimly lit alcoves, their whispers dissolving into hushed giggles. It was a stage for illicit affairs, a playground for clandestine rendezvous, where secrets were exchanged and passions ignited, all hidden in plain sight. And speaking of illicit affairs, they were as common as breathing at Versailles. Monogamy for the aristocracy was often a legal formality, not a moral imperative, especially for men. For women, the stakes were higher: reputation, inheritance, social standing could all be destroyed by an open scandal. But this didn't stop them. The court was a hotbed of infidelity, a tangled web of interconnected lovers. You'd learn to read the subtle signals, a lingering glance, a shared private joke, a certain pair of initials embroidered on a handkerchief. The king himself set the example with his parade of official and unofficial mistresses. This created an environment where fidelity was often scoffed at, and discretion was the only real virtue. Children born out of wedlock, especially to a king, were often legitimized and given titles. For lesser nobles, they might be quietly sent away or absorbed into the family as a cousin. The pursuit of sensory pleasure extended beyond gambling and sex. Dining, as we discussed, was an elaborate affair, but beyond the formal feasts, there were private supper parties, suppers. Where the food was richer, the wine flowed more freely, and the conversation was far less guarded. These were opportunities for indulgence, for overeating, for drinking to excess, a temporary escape from the rigid protocols of the public court. You might witness conversations that bordered on scandalous. Political intrigues hatched in the haze of a wine-fueled discussion, or philosophical debates that veered into dangerous territory. And then there were the more explicit forms of depravity,
Often whispered about, rarely seen by outsiders.
but undoubtedly present. Rumors of orgies, of perverse sexual acts, of encounters that pushed the boundaries of societal norms. These circulated constantly. While difficult to verify with absolute certainty, the atmosphere of extreme wealth, idleness, and moral laxity created a fertile ground for such activities. The aristocracy, feeling themselves above the common laws and morality, often indulged in behaviors that would have led to severe punishment for a commoner. You'd hear whispers of certain nobles who kept little houses in Paris or nearby villages where they could indulge their darker desires far from the prying eyes of Versailles. These were the true sinful secrets, the activities that, if exposed, could truly damage a reputation, even in a society where so much was tolerated. The contrast with the official piety of the court was stark. While the king might attend mass daily and many courtiers would outwardly display their devotion, the reality of their private lives was often profoundly unchristian. This hypocrisy was another fundamental sin of the court, the elaborate facade of morality designed to mask a vibrant, often brutal indulgence of every human appetite. The church, though powerful, often found itself in a difficult position, criticizing the king's morals while simultaneously depending on his patronage. For you in your modern world, the idea of living in such an environment of open hypocrisy and relentless temptation would be both thrilling and terrifying. The constant pressure to conform to the public image while simultaneously being surrounded by opportunities for private indulgence would be immense. You'd feel the internal conflict, the tension between what was expected and what was desired, and you'd quickly learn that the true skill in this world wasn't avoiding sin, but avoiding getting caught. Discretion, not abstinence, was the ultimate virtue when it came to forbidden pleasures. The decadence of the French court, these forbidden pleasures, weren't just about individual moral failings. They were symptoms of a deeper societal illness. This was an aristocracy increasingly detached from the realities of the vast majority of the French populace, a class lost in its own gilded bubble, indulging every whim while the peasants starved. The vast sums gambled away, the lavish spending on mistresses and parties, all came from the toil and taxes of a suffering nation. This growing chasm between the opulent lives of the few and the grinding poverty of the many was, in itself, a profound sin, an injustice that would eventually have cataclysmic consequences. As you witness these scenes of unbridled indulgence, you'd feel a prickle of unease, a sense that such excess, such disregard for morality and consequence could not possibly last forever. The foundations of this glittering world, you would realize, were built on very shaky ground indeed. You've seen the overt and covert machinations of court life, the relentless pursuit of power through status, influence, and forbidden pleasures. But now we delve into a truly chilling chapter, a period when the whispers turned deadly and the elegant facades of Versailles began to crack, revealing a terrifying underworld of black magic, sorcery, and poison. This is the infamous affair of the poisons, a scandal that rocked the court of Louis XIV to its core and left an indelible stain on the Sun King's golden reign. For you, this isn't some abstract historical event. It's a descent into a real-life horror story where trust was a dangerous luxury and death could arrive in an unsuspecting cup of wine. Imagine the year 1679. The gilded cage of Versailles, which once seemed so secure, now feels permeated by a creeping dread. Rumors, initially dismissed as idle gossip, begin to coalesce into something far more sinister. There are whispers of sudden, inexplicable deaths among the nobility, of prominent figures falling ill with bizarre symptoms that baffle the era's rudimentary doctors. The air grows thick with suspicion, and every polite invitation, every proffered goblet, is viewed with a new, chilling apprehension. You'd feel a knot of fear tightening in your stomach, a realization that the elegant Game of Thrones could, at any moment, become a game of Russian roulette with your own life. The catalyst for this unfolding horror was a woman named Catherine de Chaise, better known as La Voisin. She was no ordinary courtier. She was a Parisian fortune teller, an abortionist, and, as it turned out, a professional poisoner and practitioner of black magic. Her clientele, a startling array of high-ranking nobles desperate to gain royal favor, secure inheritances, or, most shockingly, eliminate rivals or inconvenient spouses. You might imagine her in a dark, smoky lair in a Parisian alley, her face shadowed, her voice raspy. She represented the dark underbelly of a society obsessed with power and personal gain, a mirror reflecting the hidden desires that respectable society dared not acknowledge. The investigation began almost accidentally, sparked by an earlier, smaller scandal involving a convicted poisoner named Madame de Brinvilliers. This initial inquiry, slowly, inexorably, began to unravel a much larger, more terrifying network. Lieutenant General of Police Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, a man of uncompromising integrity, was given the formidable task of uncovering the truth. He established a special court, the Chambre Ardente, burning chamber, to conduct the interrogations in secret, protecting the reputations of those implicated while ensuring a thorough, if brutal, investigation. As the arrests began, the confessions came pouring out, often extracted under torture. You'd hear the horrifying details, descriptions of succession powders designed to slowly kill off inconvenient relatives, love potions concocted from gruesome ingredients like bat's blood and human remains, and black masses performed with chilling rituals, sometimes involving the sacrifice of infants, all in the desperate hope of securing a lover's fidelity or a monarch's favor. Imagine the sheer terror of hearing these confessions, of realizing that the same perfumed hands that greeted you in the salons might also be engaged in such unspeakable acts. The line between courtly elegance and barbaric superstition had blurred, and the revelation was sickening. The sheer scale of La Voisin's network was staggering. Her services weren't cheap, and her clientele included not just ambitious nobles, but members of the highest echelons of society. And then the ultimate bombshell dropped. The investigation began to implicate people directly connected to the king's household, and even to his own beloved mistress, Madame de Montespan. Imagine the king's reaction. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who cultivated an image of divine order and absolute control, now faced a scandal that threatened to unravel the very fabric of his court and cast a shadow over his personal life. Montespan, whose power you've seen, was accused of visiting La Voisin, of using love potions to maintain the king's affection, and even of arranging black masses where, it was claimed, she prayed for the king to remain infatuated with her, and even for the queen to die. There were even allegations that Montespan sought to eliminate rival mistresses. You would feel the collective gasp of the court as these whispers reached them. The idea that the king's own mistress, the mother of his children, could be involved in such dark practices was almost unthinkable, yet the evidence, however circumstantial, was accumulating. Lorraine, unwavering in his pursuit of justice, pressed on. He interrogated those close to Montespan, including her maids and companions. The details, though often fantastical and likely exaggerated by torture or the desire of the accused to implicate others, were horrifying. Louis XIV was faced with an impossible dilemma. To publicly prosecute Montespan would be an unthinkable humiliation, a scandal that would permanently damage the prestige of the crown and expose his private life to unprecedented scrutiny. It would suggest that even his own affections could be manipulated by dark magic, undermining his divine authority. So, he made a decision, a profoundly cynical but politically pragmatic one. He ordered the inquiry into Montespan's involvement to be quietly halted. The most damning evidence, the confessions that explicitly named her, were hidden, locked away in an iron chest, later to be burned. La Voisin and her most active accomplices, however, were not spared. They were brought to trial, convicted and executed. La Voisin herself was burned at the stake in 1680, her screams echoing through the streets of Paris. Numerous other poisoners and sorcerers were hanged, tortured, or sent to the galleys. The message was clear: there were limits to the king's tolerance, even for the upper echelons. But the true extent of the court's depravity, the involvement of its most glittering stars, remained a dark secret known only to a select few, and later to historians who pieced together the fragments of the suppressed investigation. The legacy of the affair of the poisons was profound. It shattered any lingering illusions of innocence at the court. It showed you the dark, desperate lengths to which people would go to secure power and affection. It revealed a hidden world of superstition and barbarity lurking beneath the polished surface of Enlightenment-era France. It also demonstrated the immense power of the monarch to suppress inconvenient truths, to manipulate justice for the sake of his own image and the stability of his reign. You'd realize that even the absolute truth was negotiable when the reputation of the Sun King was at stake for you. In your modern world, where forensic science and due process are cornerstones of justice, the idea of a secret investigation, a special court, and the arbitrary suppression of evidence would be shocking. It underscores the immense power of the individual ruler and the fragility of justice in a system where the king's will was absolute. The affair of the poisons was a raw, visceral demonstration of the moral corruption that could fester in the heart of extreme power, where ambition knew no bounds and the darkest impulses of human nature found fertile ground to flourish.
Fueled by the glittering prizes of courtly life.
And as you imagine the chilling spectre of a poisoned drink or a whispered curse, you would feel a deep gratitude for the protections and certainties of your own time, far removed from the chilling shadows of Louis XIV's burning chamber. You've witnessed the splendor and the sinister undercurrents of the French court. Now, let's bring you face to face with a fundamental, often brutal, reality of life in the 17th and 18th centuries, the constant, terrifying precariousness of health, even for the most powerful individuals on Earth. Forget your modern antibiotics, your vaccines, your pain relief, your sterile operating rooms. In this era, the royal body, despite being treated with almost divine reverence, was frighteningly vulnerable to disease, and the medical practices intended to cure it were often more terrifying than the ailments themselves. You, with your understanding of germ theory and advanced medicine, would be horrified and profoundly grateful for the scientific progress that separates your comfort from their constant suffering. Imagine, first, the air itself. We spoke of the pervasive smells of Versailles, but beyond the odors, consider the invisible killers lurking in the environment. Smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis. These were not just historical footnotes. They were ever-present specters sweeping through populations with terrifying regularity, claiming lives indiscriminately from pauper to prince. You'd know of entire families decimated by a single outbreak. The concept of airborne viruses or bacteria was utterly unknown. Instead, people believed in miasmas, bad air, or imbalances of humors within the body. This fundamental misunderstanding of disease meant that prevention was almost non-existent, and treatment was often based on superstition or outdated theories. Let's focus on the king himself. Louis XIV, despite his image as the robust Sun King, he was plagued by a litany of ailments throughout his life. He suffered from gout, dental problems, persistent fevers, and the notorious anal fistula that nearly killed him. Imagine being Louis XIV, a man whose public persona demanded unshakable strength, yet whose body was a constant battleground. The pain would be immense, often debilitating, yet he had to perform, to attend councils, to hunt, to dance, to project an image of effortless command. You'd feel the immense pressure he faced to mask his suffering, to maintain the illusion of divine health. And what about the doctors? The royal physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries were highly paid, highly respected figures, but their knowledge was severely limited by modern standards. Their primary tools were observation, bleeding, purging, and the administration of often bizarre and ineffective remedies. Bloodletting was a cornerstone of their practice. If you had a fever or almost any ailment, the first response would be to open a vein and drain a pint or more of your blood, sometimes multiple times. The belief was that illness was caused by an excess of blood or an imbalance of humors, and that letting blood would restore equilibrium. You, knowing the vital role of blood, would flinch at the sight, understanding that this procedure often weakened patients, making them more susceptible to infection. Rather than curing them, purging was another common treatment. Vomiting and violent laxatives were administered to cleanse the body of toxins. Imagine the discomfort, the indignity of these treatments, often administered publicly or in the presence of curious courtiers. You'd be subjected to foul-tasting concoctions designed to induce violent reactions, all in the desperate hope of driving out the illness. The royal body, for all its divinity, was still a subject for invasive, often brutal, medical intervention. Take Louis XIV's infamous anal fistula in 1686. This was an excruciatingly painful condition, an abscess near the anus that caused constant discomfort and made sitting, riding, or even standing for long periods agonizing. The king was in immense pain. His surgeons debated for months. The royal surgeon, Charles-François Félix, was tasked with performing a pioneering operation. Imagine the scene. No anesthesia beyond perhaps a strong drink, no sterile environment beyond what little cleanliness could be achieved, no antibiotics. The king, awake and fully aware, would endure the surgeon's knife, the cutting and probing, the agonizing pain. The operation was a success, but the recovery would have been prolonged and excruciating, constantly threatened by infection. You'd wince at the thought, the raw, visceral understanding of what such an operation would entail in that era. Childbirth was another terrifying ordeal. For noble women, despite the presence of experienced midwives and sometimes male surgeons, it was a journey through unimaginable pain and often ended in tragedy. Maternal mortality rates were incredibly high. Infant mortality was even higher. You'd see families with numerous children, knowing that only a fraction would survive to adulthood. This constant loss, this pervasive grief, was a backdrop to the glittering gaiety of court. The Dauphin, the king's heir, lost his entire immediate family, his wife and 2 sons, within a single year to a mysterious illness, likely smallpox or measles. Imagine the profound trauma of such a loss, even for a monarch. Dental hygiene was virtually non-existent by your standards. Sugar was a luxury, but a dangerous one, contributing to widespread tooth decay. Extractions were common, performed by barber surgeons without anesthesia, often resulting in broken jaws or severe infections. Louis XIV himself suffered terribly from toothaches and had most of his upper teeth extracted, leading to a fistula that connected his mouth to his nasal cavity, causing him difficulty in eating and speaking. Imagine the constant discomfort, the chronic pain that even the most powerful man in Europe endured simply from poor dental health. You'd feel a twinge of phantom pain, a deep appreciation for your own toothbrush and regular dental checkups. And then there was the world of quackery. Alongside the official physicians, charlatans and mountebanks thrived. Desperate for cures, nobles would turn to anyone who promised relief, from astrologers concocting herbal remedies to supposed alchemists selling elixirs of life. You'd see these figures, often flamboyant and persuasive, preying on the fears and ignorance of the wealthy, offering false hope for a hefty price. This blend of legitimate for the time medicine and outright fraud was another sinful secret of the era, a testament to humanity's enduring vulnerability in the face of illness. The psychological toll of this constant threat of disease was immense. Every headache, every cough, every ache could be the harbinger of a deadly illness. The fear of contagion was palpable, yet largely misunderstood. When a disease swept through the court, panic often ensued, with nobles fleeing to their country estates, hoping to escape the invisible killer. You'd feel that primal fear, the helplessness in the face of an unseen enemy, a fear that your own modern world, with its medical advances, has largely eradicated. This constant battle with the fragile royal body served as a stark contrast to the divine image Louis XIV cultivated. It reminded everyone, including the king himself, of his fundamental humanity, his mortality. Yet the court meticulously maintained the illusion of his superhuman vitality. His every public appearance, every successful recovery from illness was celebrated as a sign of divine favor. This tension between the fragile human body and the infallible royal persona was a powerful, unspoken narrative at Versailles, a constant reminder that even the Sun King was ultimately bound by the limitations of flesh and blood, a reality that no amount of gold or power could overcome. You would walk through these halls, recognizing that beneath the powdered wigs and lavish silks lay bodies vulnerable to decay, pain, and death, just like any commoner. A sobering thought in the heart of such extravagant power. You've been immersed in the relentless, tightly controlled world of Louis XIV, a monarch who personified the state and whose every action was a deliberate act of power. Now fast forward a few decades. The Sun King is gone, his long reign ending in 1715. His successor, his great-grandson, is Louis XV, and with him, a profound shift in the atmosphere of the French court. The relentless dynamism, the rigid discipline, the sheer presence of Louis XIV gives way to something different, something more languid, more private, and ultimately more dangerous for the monarchy. You, having just lived through the Sun King's reign, would immediately feel the change, a palpable shift in the very air of Versailles. Imagine walking through the Hall of Mirrors again. It's still dazzling, still grand, but there's a subtle difference. The hustle and bustle is there, but perhaps less frenetic. The whispers are still abundant, but perhaps they carry more cynicism, less fear. The absolute magnetic pull of the king, the way every gaze was directed towards Louis XIV, is diminished. Louis XV, though handsome and intelligent, possessed a very different temperament. He was shy, melancholic, and deeply private. He found the elaborate rituals of his great-grandfather suffocating, preferring the quiet intimacy of smaller gatherings to the grand public spectacles. This was a king who actively retreated from the public eye. Where Louis XIV meticulously orchestrated his daily life as a perpetual performance of power, Louis XV sought to escape it. His lever and couche, though still existing, became less well attended, less vital. He began to spend more time in his private apartments, the petit cabinets, or at smaller, more intimate palaces like Compiègne or Fontainebleau. For you, this might sound like a relief, a move towards modern comfort. But for the court of Versailles, it was a disorienting shift. The entire system was built on proximity to the monarch. When the monarch withdrew, the system faltered. The impact of this royal indifference was profound. The powerful nobles who had once flocked to Versailles, desperate for a glimpse of the king, for a chance to catch his eye, now found themselves with less direct access. The traditional channels of patronage and influence became murkier. This bred a sense of frustration, and for some, a dangerous cynicism. If the king wasn't interested in the day-to-day governance, who was truly in charge? This vacuum of direct, royal authority led to a scramble for power among competing factions of ministers and ambitious courtiers, often fueled by the king's mistresses. Louis XV's private nature also meant he was more easily swayed by personal relationships. His early love for his queen, Marie Leschinska, was genuine, but her piety and his wandering eye eventually led to a string of influential mistresses who would come to define his reign. These women, like Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry, would step into the void created by the king's reluctance to engage directly with the larger court, becoming powerful intermediaries. You'd see their apartments become the new centers
of influence, where real decisions were made, far from the formal councils.
The atmosphere at court shifted from the rigid, awestruck reverence of Louis XIV's time to one of ennui, even decadence. With less direct royal oversight, nobles felt freer to indulge their appetites, their gambling, their affairs. The court became a playground for sophisticated pleasures, where wit and charm were valued as much as, if not more than, unwavering loyalty. You'd observe the rising importance of intellectual salons, where philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau, though often critical of absolute monarchy, began to find an audience among the aristocracy. The seeds of Enlightenment thought were being sown even within the palace walls, quietly undermining the very foundations of the system. The sin of Louis XV's reign, if you could call it that, was not necessarily a moral failing in the same vein as Louis XIV's overt affairs, but rather a sin of omission, the sin of indifference, of a monarch detached from his duties, from his people, and from the grand machinery of state. His famous phrase, "Après moi le déluge," after me the flood. Whether he actually said it or not, perfectly captures this sense of fatalistic detachment. He seemed to recognize the precariousness of the situation, the growing discontent, but felt powerless or unwilling to arrest the decline. His early popularity, earned as Louis the Beloved after he recovered from a grave illness, slowly eroded. His disastrous foreign policy decisions, particularly the loss of French territory in the 7 Years' War, were met with growing public anger. The financial situation of France, already strained, worsened significantly under his reign. And you, walking through the palace, would feel the echoes of this discontent, the growing murmurs of criticism that were once unthinkable during Louis XIV's time. Pamphlets, once banned or circulated in secret, became bolder, openly attacking the king, his mistresses, and his government. This indifference extended to the spiritual well-being of the court. While outwardly pious, Louis XV's frequent retreats to his petits cabinets or his various hunting lodges meant he spent less time fulfilling the traditional ceremonial and religious duties of a monarch. This further eroded the moral authority of the crown, and for a nation still deeply Catholic, this was a significant concern. You'd notice the subtle shift in religious fervor, the growing secularization of intellectual thought, even as priests and confessors still held considerable sway over individual consciences. For you observing this, it would be a chilling demonstration of how a monarchy can slowly rot from within, not through outright tyranny, but through a gradual erosion of commitment and presence. Louis XV was not a cruel king, but his detachment, his preference for private pleasures over public duties, created a vacuum that others were all too eager to fill, often to the detriment of the nation. The dazzling spectacle of Versailles continued, but the heart of the machine, the king, was increasingly absent, leaving the grand edifice to operate on inertia, its ultimate collapse becoming an increasingly inevitable, if distant, prospect. You would walk away from this era with a profound understanding that even absolute power requires constant engagement, and that indifference, in the hands of a king, can be as destructive as any tyranny. You've seen Louis XIV's retreat into privacy, his preference for intimate gatherings over grand public spectacles. Now prepare yourself for one of the most scandalous and perhaps most morally compromising aspects of his reign, the parc aux cerfs. This was not merely a love nest, it was, for all intents and purposes, a hidden seraglio, a collection of young women procured for the king's private pleasure, far from the prying eyes of the court, and crucially, from the queen. For you in your modern world, the idea of a head of state maintaining such an establishment is deeply disturbing, a stark reminder of the absolute power and moral immunity enjoyed by monarchs of this era. Imagine Versailles, still shimmering with gold and teeming with courtiers. But beyond its grand gates, in a quieter, more discreet part of the royal domain, lies the town of Versailles itself. And within this town, a seemingly innocuous house purchased by the king's agents. This was the Parc aux Cerfs, literally, Deer Park, a name that evokes innocence but hid a darker reality. It was established primarily at the instigation of Madame de Pompadour, the king's official mistress, not as a place for her own enjoyment, but as a strategic tool. Pompadour, knowing the king's insatiable appetite for female company and his tendency to seek out new conquests, sought to control this aspect of his life. By providing him with compliant, discreet young women, she hoped to prevent him from falling deeply in love with a rival who might usurp her political influence. This, in itself, is a chilling testament to the brutal pragmatism of courtly power. You would imagine the meticulous operation of this harem. The young women chosen were typically from respectable, though not aristocratic, families, often lured by promises of financial security for themselves and their relatives. They were often very young, some barely out of childhood, though the king's preferences varied. They were housed in comfortable, well-appointed rooms, educated and trained in the arts of pleasing the king. They were taught to be discreet, to never speak of their royal patron, and to understand that their role was to provide pleasure and companionship without demanding the emotional or political commitment that a mistress like Pompadour enjoyed. Imagine the lives of these women. For some, it might have been an escape from poverty, a chance for a better life. For others, it was a gilded cage, a loss of autonomy and agency, their bodies and futures controlled by the king's whims. They lived in relative luxury, but under constant surveillance, their world confined to the walls of the Parc aux Cerfs. They were given new identities, new names to further ensure their anonymity. They were mothers to the king's illegitimate children, who were then quietly raised elsewhere, their royal paternity a secret. You'd feel a profound sense of pity for them, caught in a system that valued their youth and beauty, but denied them true freedom or a public identity. The sin here is multi-layered. It's the sin of exploitation, of using young women as instruments of royal pleasure, discarding them when their freshness faded. It's the sin of deception, of a monarch leading a double life, maintaining an image of public piety while indulging in private licentiousness. And it's the sin of hypocrisy, of an aristocracy that condemned immorality in commoners but often turned a blind eye to the transgressions of their king. The logistics of the king's visits to the Parc aux Cerfs would be fascinating and unsettling to observe. He would often travel in a closed carriage, often disguised, slipping away from Versailles under the cloak of night, accompanied by only a few trusted valets. The discretion was paramount. The pretense was that he was merely visiting friends or engaged in some private business. But the truth was a poorly kept secret among the highest echelons of the court and certain circles in Paris. The Parisian public, however, often embellished the tales, imagining a far grander and more populated harem than actually existed, fueled by anti-monarchical sentiment. This arrangement allowed Louis XVII to indulge his desires without the political complications and public scrutiny that came with an official mistress like Madame de Pompadour. He enjoyed the novelty, the youth, and the lack of expectations from these women. They were not political operators, they were not demanding titles or favors for their families. They were simply there for his pleasure. This appealed to his melancholic and private nature, offering a refuge from the constant demands of court life and the burdens of kingship. The existence of the Parc aux Cerfs deeply damaged Louis XV's reputation, contributing to the erosion of public respect for the monarchy that characterized his reign. While the official court might feign ignorance, the public knew enough, and their outrage simmered. This private indulgence, paid for by state funds, was seen as a profound betrayal, a symbol of royal decadence and indifference to the suffering of the French people. For you, it highlights the immense disconnect between the ruler and the ruled, a chasm that was growing wider with each passing year. Imagine the psychological impact on the king. Constantly seeking new pleasures, always pursuing the ephemeral thrill of novelty, yet never finding lasting satisfaction. His emotional life seemed to be a series of fleeting attachments, a pattern that speaks to a deeper ennui, a profound boredom that no amount of power or pleasure could alleviate. He was a king who pursued sensation, yet remained detached, melancholic. This pursuit of gratification, devoid of genuine connection, was another aspect of the sinful secrets that defined his character and his reign. Ultimately, the Parc aux Cerfs stands as a stark example of the abuse of absolute power. It represents a system where the monarch felt entitled to literally procure human beings for his personal gratification, without accountability, without moral compunction. It embodies the deepest forms of moral decay within the court, reflecting not just the king's personal failings, but the societal structures that enabled and protected such behavior. You would leave this story with a renewed understanding of the dangers of unchecked power and a chilling appreciation for the human cost of a monarch's unbridled desires. This hidden retreat, you'd realize, was far more than a simple love nest. It was a symbol of a monarchy increasingly lost in its own self-indulgence,
oblivious to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. You've just glimpsed the hidden depths of Louis XV's private life at the Parc aux Cerfs.
a place of fleeting pleasures and concealed identities. Now let's turn to a woman who exerted a far more profound, public, and enduring influence on the king and on France itself. Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, Madame de Pompadour. She was not born into the aristocracy, but rose through sheer force of will, intellect, and charm to become one of the most powerful women in French history. For you, she represents a fascinating paradox, a royal mistress who transcended the traditional role of a sexual companion to become a cultural icon, a political advisor, and a symbol of both Enlightenment patronage and royal decadence. Imagine her origin. She wasn't a noble, but a woman from the high bourgeoisie, the daughter of a financier with a shadow of scandal over his name. But from a young age, she was groomed for greatness. Her mother, and perhaps even her likely biological father, a wealthy tax farmer, recognized her exceptional intelligence, beauty, and artistic talents. She was educated in the finest arts, cultivated her wit, learned to sing, dance, draw, and play musical instruments. She was, in essence, a meticulously crafted diamond, ready to shine. You'd see in her early life the ambition of a family determined to rise, a stark contrast to the inherited privilege of the nobility. Her entry into the king's life was not by chance. She was deliberately placed in his orbit, appearing at masked balls where she knew he would be, dressing as a huntress to catch his eye during royal hunts. Imagine the sheer audacity, the calculated risk. She was married, but her marriage was a convenient social arrangement. Louis XV, with his constant yearning for novelty and his deep-seated melancholy, was captivated. He needed intellectual companionship as much as physical pleasure, and Pompadour offered both in spades. You'd feel the immense power of her charisma, the way she could hold the attention of the most powerful man in Europe, not just with her looks, but with her mind. Her official presentation at court as the maîtresse en titre, official mistress, in 1745 was a momentous event. She was granted the title Marquise de Pompadour and an aristocratic coat of arms. Imagine her stepping into that glittering, hostile environment, a commoner amidst centuries of noble blood. She was met with immediate, ferocious opposition. The old aristocracy, entrenched in their inherited privileges, despised her common birth. They spread vicious rumors, called her poissonnette, little fish, and mocked her relentlessly. You'd feel the palpable animosity, the collective sneer of the court as she navigated these treacherous waters. But she persevered, protected by the king's unwavering affection. Her power was not just sexual, it quickly became intellectual and political. She recognized that the king's temperament required more than just physical intimacy. He was easily bored, prone to melancholy, and struggled with the burdens of kingship. Pompadour made herself indispensable as his confidant, his companion, his therapist. She entertained him, created diversions, discussed philosophy, art, and even affairs of state. You'd see her spending countless hours with him, far beyond what was required of a mistress, becoming the one person he truly trusted and relied upon. She effectively became the king's de facto prime minister for many years. She advised him on appointments, helped formulate foreign policy, and influenced treaties. Ministers who wished to gain the king's ear knew they had to cultivate her favor first. Her apartments, like Montespan's before her, became a new center of political gravity, a salon where decisions were quietly made, careers advanced, and rivals thwarted. Imagine the power she wielded. A single word from her could elevate a protégé or consign an enemy to oblivion. You would feel the magnetic pull of her influence, the way courtiers would flock to her, hoping to catch her eye, to gain her support. But her influence extended far beyond politics. Madame de Pompadour was a passionate patroness of the arts and sciences, a true product of the Enlightenment. She championed the Sèvres porcelain factory, supporting its artistic development. She encouraged the growth of the Encyclopédie, that monumental work of Enlightenment thought, defending its editors from royal censorship. She was a patron of architects, painters, sculptors, and writers. She influenced fashion, interior design, and even the king's military academies, such as the École Militaire. You'd see the elegant, sophisticated taste she brought to the court, transforming it into a center of cultural innovation. Her legacy is literally etched into the very fabric of French culture. Her health was always delicate, and after a few years, a physical relationship with the king ceased.
Likely due to her ill health and perhaps his wandering eye.
But remarkably, her political and personal influence over Louis XV only deepened. This is perhaps her greatest triumph and a testament to her unique power. She transitioned from royal mistress to indispensable companion and advisor, a friend of the king, retaining her position until her death. This was a sinful secret of a different kind, the transgression of traditional gender roles of a woman not born royal or even aristocratic, wielding such profound and public power in a patriarchal society. She broke every rule, yet thrived. However, her position came at a profound cost. The public, enduring wars and rising taxes, hated her. They saw her as a symbol of royal extravagance, an evil commoner who manipulated their beloved king. Vicious caricatures and pamphlets depicted her as a prostitute, a witch, a spendthrift. They blamed her for every military defeat, every financial crisis. You'd feel the raw hatred directed at her, the resentment from a suffering populace, a stark contrast to the adulation she received within the palace. She bore the brunt of public discontent, becoming a lightning rod for the monarchy's growing unpopularity. Her constant political maneuvering, her need to maintain her position, meant that she made powerful enemies. Yet, she maintained her dignity and her unwavering loyalty to the king. When she died in 1764, Louis XV was genuinely heartbroken, despite their lack of physical intimacy for years. He watched her funeral procession from a window, supposedly remarking, "The Marquise will not have fine weather for her journey." A cold statement, perhaps, but one that belied the deep, complex bond they shared. The rise of Madame de Pompadour represents a crucial shift in the nature of power at the French court. It showed that intellect, ambition, and cultural acumen could, in certain circumstances, trump ancient lineage and even the traditional boundaries of gender and class. But it also highlighted the fragility of such power, dependent entirely on the king's affection and subject to the relentless scrutiny and hatred of both the aristocracy and the populace. You would look back at her life and recognize not just a royal mistress, but a formidable woman who, through sheer will and intelligence, left an indelible mark on an entire century, for better or for worse, embodying the ultimate sin of ambition in a society that preferred women to remain quietly in the background. You've seen the formidable intellect and cultural power of Madame de Pompadour, a woman who rose from the bourgeoisie to effectively co-rule France. Now, let's transition to the twilight of Louis XV's reign and the emergence of his last official mistress, Madame du Barry. Her story is a stark contrast to Pompadour's, one of raw beauty, common origins, and a tragic encounter with a young, haughty Dauphine, Marie Antoinette, that would seal her fate and further erode public respect for the monarchy. For you, this is a tale of social snobbery, naked ambition, and the growing, dangerous chasm between the old order and the coming revolution. Imagine the king, Louis XV, is older now. His beloved Pompadour has passed away, and he is a man increasingly alone, susceptible to the charms of a new face. Into this void steps Jeanne Bécu, a woman of even humbler origins than Pompadour. She was born a commoner, an illegitimate child, who, through a series of liaisons and her striking beauty, became a high-class courtesan in Parisian society. She was vivacious, charming, and possessed a natural, unpretentious elegance. You'd see her, sparkling with a youthful energy that perhaps reminded the aging king of happier times, a stark contrast to the heavy burdens of state. Her introduction to the king was orchestrated by her lover, the Comte du Barry, who, seeing an opportunity for social advancement, pushed her into the royal orbit. The king was immediately smitten, but for Jeanne to become the official maîtresse en titre, she needed a legitimate husband to present her at court, as a courtesan could not simply be introduced. So she was hastily married to the Comte du Barry's brother Guillaume, making her Madame du Barry. Imagine the cynical maneuvering, the sheer audacity of this arrangement. It was a blatant social fiction, a marriage of convenience for a title, designed solely to gain access to the king. You'd feel the palpable outrage of the aristocracy, who saw this as an insult to their ancient lineage and a degradation of the court. Her formal presentation at court in 1769 was a disaster. Unlike Pompadour, who had cultivated powerful allies and possessed a formidable intellect, Du Barry was seen as an uneducated, vulgar upstart. The old nobility, especially the influential female courtiers, ostracized her completely. They found her manners uncouth, her background scandalous, and her very presence an affront to the dignity of the French monarchy. You'd observe the pointed snubs, the averted gazes, the cruel whispers that followed her every step. She, in turn, often responded with a charming simplicity that further inflamed their disdain, sometimes even mocking their rigid etiquette. The king, however, was completely devoted to her. He showered her with gifts, jewels, and magnificent apartments at Versailles, including a splendid chateau at Louvciennes. He found solace in her light-hearted company, her cheerful disposition, and her genuine affection. She provided an escape from the somber duties of state, a contrast to the intellectual rigors of Pompadour. For you, it's a poignant picture, an aging king, clinging to a vibrant, unpretentious woman in a desperate search for happiness in his final years. The most famous, and ultimately most damaging, aspect of her reign as mistress was her feud with the young Dauphine, Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette, newly arrived from Austria, was initially taught to disdain Du Barry by the powerful anti-Du Barry faction at court. The Dauphine, proud of her royal lineage and deeply influenced by her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, considered Du Barry's presence at court and her common origins to be utterly repulsive. According to court etiquette, the Dauphine was not supposed to address a commoner of questionable background unless addressed first.
Du Barry, as the king's official mistress, held a position that demanded respect, yet Marie Antoinette refused to speak to her. Imagine the tension.
The entire court held its breath, witnessing this silent, dramatic standoff. The king was furious, his royal will openly defied by his own granddaughter-in-law. Marie Antoinette's mother, Empress Maria Theresa, bombarded her with letters, urging her to speak to Du Barry to appease the king and protect the vital Franco-Austrian alliance. The French ambassador to Vienna, Mercy Argenteau, also pleaded with the Dauphine, explaining the immense political consequences of her obstinacy. You'd feel the immense pressure on Marie Antoinette, the burden of her foreignness and her inexperience, caught between her pride and political necessity. The silence between the two women lasted for months, causing immense diplomatic strain. Finally, on New Year's Day 1772, after intense pressure from Vienna and the king, Marie Antoinette uttered the famous reluctant phrase to Du Barry, "Il y a bien du monde à Versailles." Aujourd'hui, there are a great many people at Versailles. Today, this seemingly innocuous remark was a monumental victory for Du Barry and a profound humiliation for Marie Antoinette, forcing her to acknowledge the mistress's presence. You'd understand the subtle power of these courtly rituals, where a single, seemingly trivial sentence could carry such immense political weight. This forced capitulation, however, did not foster reconciliation. Instead, it further solidified Marie Antoinette's resentment towards Du Barry and the decadent court. It also fueled public animosity towards the king's mistress, solidifying her image as a manipulative figure who even defied royalty. The sin here is not just Du Barry's perceived immorality or social climbing, it's the sin of royal indifference to public opinion, of an aging king clinging to personal pleasure while the realm suffered. It's also the sin of social snobbery and the rigid class system that made Du Barry's rise so scandalous and her acceptance so bitterly contested. Du Barry's reign as mistress ended abruptly with the death of Louis XV in 1774, with the new king, Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, on the throne. Du Barry was immediately banished from court. She was sent to a convent, then eventually to her beloved chateau at Louvciennes, where she lived a comfortable, though isolated, life. Her story, however, takes a tragic turn during the French Revolution. Despite her efforts to remain neutral, her association with the old regime and her perceived extravagance made her a target. She was ultimately guillotined in 1793, a victim of the very revolution whose seeds were sown, in part, by the scandals and moral failings of the monarchy she served. The fate of Madame du Barry serves as a chilling epilogue to the era of royal mistresses. Her story highlights the extreme precariousness of power at court, especially for those whose influence stemmed solely from a king's affection. It also underscores the growing chasm between the self-indulgent monarchy and a suffering populace, a divide exacerbated by the perceived corruption and moral laxity symbolized by figures like du Barry. You would leave her story with a deep sense of the tragic irony. A woman who merely sought to please her king, becoming a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old order, destined to be swept away by the coming storm. Her life a poignant illustration of the sinful secrets that ultimately consumed the French monarchy. You've witnessed the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XV, eras defined by dazzling power and simmering decadence. Now let's shift our focus to a new face, a young woman who would become one of history's most iconic and tragic figures, Marie Antoinette. She arrives at the French court as a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess destined to marry the Dauphin, the future Louis XVI. Her early years at Versailles are not the fairy tale you might imagine, but a baptism of fire, a relentless gauntlet of cultural shock, impossible expectations, and the poisonous whispers of a deeply hostile court. For you, this isn't just a historical narrative. It's an immersive experience in the brutal realities of royal arranged marriage and the suffocating pressure of public life. Imagine her journey. You are this young girl plucked from the relatively informal, affectionate court of your mother, Empress Maria Theresa, in Vienna. You speak German, a language alien to France. You arrive at the French border for the handover ceremony, where every stitch of your Austrian clothing is stripped from you, and you are dressed anew in French fashions, severing your last physical link to your homeland. This symbolic act, designed to make you fully French, is a brutal, dehumanizing experience. You are no longer just a girl. You are a political symbol, a living treaty, a guarantee of the alliance between two great, often warring powers. You feel the weight of this immense responsibility, the crushing expectation to be perfect, to be French. Your first impressions of Versailles would be overwhelming. The sheer scale, the opulence, the hundreds of people, all staring, all judging. You'd be struck by the rigid etiquette, far more formal and complex than anything you experience in Austria.
Every movement, every gesture, every word is prescribed.
You are taught how to walk, how to curtsy, how to hold your fan, how to conduct polite conversation. You are constantly observed, analyzed, critiqued by an entire court that, for the most part, resents your Austrian origins. You are l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, a term that will, in time, become an epithet. Your marriage to the awkward, shy, and intellectually slower Dauphin, Louis Auguste, is not one of love. He is well-meaning, pious, and shares your love of hunting, but he is also emotionally distant and famously uninterested in physical intimacy, at least initially. Their marriage goes unconsummated for 7 long years, a fact that becomes a major source of scandal and anxiety for the monarchy. Imagine the immense pressure on you, the Dauphin, to produce an heir, the primary duty of any royal bride. The whispers, the cruel jokes, the doctors brought in to examine both you and your husband. It would be a humiliating, terrifying ordeal, a public failure that you could do nothing to correct. You'd feel your reputation and the stability of the entire Franco-Austrian alliance hanging precariously on your ability to produce a child. Compounding your misery is the open hostility of the king's daughters, the Mesdames de France, your aunts. These unmarried, deeply pious, and often bitter princesses resent your presence, seeing you as an extension of the hated Austrian alliance and a rival for their father's affection. They scrutinize your every move, criticize your every choice, and constantly undermine you. You'd feel their cold stares, their dismissive remarks, their subtle machinations, an endless barrage of psychological warfare that would chip away at your youthful confidence. And then there's the king's mistress, Madame du Barry. As we discussed, you initially refused to acknowledge her, a principled stand born of your royal pride and the influence of your anti-du Barry court faction. But this refusal earns you the king's grave displeasure and creates a diplomatic crisis. Your mother, Empress Maria Theresa, sends furious letters, reminding you of your duty to the alliance to conciliate the king. You are caught between your own sense of decorum and the immense political pressure to compromise. The famous "Il y a bien du monde à Versailles aujourd'hui" line is eventually uttered, a humiliating capitulation, but one that leaves a deep scar. You'd feel the shame, the resentment, the burning injustice of being forced to acknowledge a woman you considered beneath you. To escape the relentless scrutiny and the suffocating etiquette, you seek solace in pleasures. You begin to indulge in extravagant fashions, creating new, often daring hairstyles that earn both admiration and condemnation. You gamble, perhaps excessively, racking up significant debts. You attend balls, opera, and private theatricals, seeking diversion. You surround yourself with a circle of young, often frivolous friends, earning them the nickname the Polignacs, who are seen by the court as parasitical and manipulative. These choices, understandable as a young woman seeking escape, further cement your reputation as extravagant, irresponsible, and frivolous. You'd feel the heady rush of freedom in these indulgences, but also the gnawing awareness of the growing criticisms, the knowledge that you are constantly being judged. The sins of Marie Antoinette in these early years are not malicious. They are the sins of inexperience, of a young woman trying to navigate an impossible situation, of seeking escape from unbearable pressure. Her extravagance is often a coping mechanism, a way to assert her identity in a world that seeks to define and constrain her. Her frivolity is a desperate attempt to find joy in a role that is devoid of genuine affection and riddled with political pitfalls. The court, with its countless eyes and endless tongues, becomes a breeding ground for gossip and slander against you. Every late night, every new gown, every gambling loss is exaggerated, distorted, and weaponized by your enemies. You, the foreign Dauphine, are an easy target, a convenient scapegoat for the monarchy's existing problems. The seeds of the future, Madame Deficit, are sown in these early years, long before you become queen, fueled by a court that resents your foreignness and a public that is increasingly alienated from its rulers. For you, observing this young Marie Antoinette, it's a poignant tale. You'd see a girl trying to find her footing in a world that offers immense luxury, but little warmth, immense power, but no true freedom. You'd feel the burden of her crown, not as a symbol of glory, but as a heavy, suffocating weight. Her early struggles and her attempts to cope, though often perceived as sinful by her contemporaries, reveal the profound humanity beneath the royal facade. A young woman desperately trying to survive in a gilded cage that was slowly, inexorably, tightening its bars around her. The private anguish of her unconsummated marriage, the public humiliation of her courtly battles, and the growing resentment of a nation, these were the true burdens of the Dauphine, setting the stage for a tragedy that would engulf an entire nation. You've just witnessed Marie Antoinette's difficult early years as Dauphine, battling courtly hostility and struggling with the immense pressure of her role. Now let's fast forward to her time as queen and immerse ourselves in the scandal that irrevocably shattered her reputation and fueled the growing public hatred against her, the infamous diamond necklace affair. This wasn't merely a courtly squabble. It was a labyrinthine plot of fraud, ambition, and sexual intrigue that became a seismic event, an undeniable, sinful secret that, whether she was innocent or guilty, cemented her image as Madame Deficit and a morally corrupt monarch. For you, this story is a chilling demonstration of how easily public opinion can be manipulated and how a queen's perceived extravagance could ignite the fires of revolution. Imagine the year 1785. France is teetering on the brink of financial collapse, burdened by immense debts from wars and royal spending. The common people are starving, groaning under heavy taxes. Meanwhile, the Queen, Marie Antoinette, has already earned a reputation for lavish fashion, extravagant parties, and her deep love for jewels. She has become the scapegoat for every financial woe, every public grievance. You, watching the mood of the nation, would feel the palpable tension, the simmering resentment that only needed a spark to ignite. The diamond necklace affair provided that spark. The story begins with a truly magnificent piece of jewelry, a diamond necklace, so breathtakingly beautiful and so astonishingly expensive that even Louis XV had reportedly refused to buy it for Madame du Barry, deeming it too costly. It comprised 647 flawless diamonds weighing 2,800 carats, valued at an astronomical 1.6 million livres, roughly equivalent to $100 million in today's currency. Imagine the sparkle, the sheer weight of these gems, a symbol of unimaginable wealth. The Parisian jewelers Baume and Bassange, desperate to sell this white elephant, saw their last hope in the new queen, Marie Antoinette. The queen, however, had already turned down the necklace once. She was trying belatedly to curb her image of extravagance and perhaps genuinely felt that such a sum would be better spent on warships for the French Navy. She had famously declared, "We have more need of ships than of necklaces." But the jewelers, desperate to recoup their investment, persisted. Enter the main players in this elaborate conquête. Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Rémy, Comtesse de la Motte, a minor, impoverished aristocrat, distantly related to the Valois royal line, but with no real standing or wealth. She was ambitious, cunning, and utterly ruthless. Imagine her scheming and dreaming of a grand life, resenting her poverty while surrounded by royal splendor. Cardinal Louis de Rohan, a powerful and immensely wealthy prince of the church, but one who was in deep disgrace. He had served as ambassador to Austria, where he had offended Empress Maria Theresa, and thus earned the lasting enmity of Marie Antoinette. He was desperate to regain the Queen's favor, to secure a prestigious appointment like Prime Minister, and to cement his position at court. Imagine his ambition, his vanity, his desperate need for royal approval. Joseph Balsamo calling himself Alessandro Cagliostro. A notorious charlatan, an alchemist, a mystic, and a con artist who claimed to have supernatural powers. He was a master of illusion and manipulation, a man who preyed on the credulous rich. A prostitute named Nicole d'Oliva. She bore a striking resemblance to Marie Antoinette and was persuaded to play the queen in a series of clandestine encounters. The plot was a masterpiece of deception. Lamotte, knowing Rohan's desperate desire for royal favor and his strained relationship with the queen, convinced him that Marie Antoinette secretly desired the necklace but couldn't openly purchase it due to public opinion. Lamotte fabricated a series of letters, supposedly from the Queen, expressing affection for Rohan and instructing him to purchase the necklace on her behalf, promising to reimburse him in installments. Rohan, blinded by his desperate ambition and vanity, believed these forged letters. Then came the night rendezvous. Lamotte arranged for Rohan to meet the Queen in the gardens of Versailles at night. It wasn't Marie Antoinette, of course, but Nicole d'Oliva, dressed to resemble the Queen. In the darkness, she handed Rohan a single rose and whispered a few vague words of reassurance, assuring him of the Queen's favor. Imagine Rohan's ecstatic belief, his complete submission to this elaborate charade. He felt he was finally back in the Queen's good graces, perhaps even becoming her secret lover. Convinced he was acting for the Queen, Rohan took delivery of the magnificent diamond necklace from the jewelers, signing a guarantee for the payments. He then handed it over to Lamotte, believing she would deliver it to the Queen. Lamotte, of course, immediately began dismantling the necklace, selling the diamonds individually on the black markets of Paris and London, using the vast sums to fund a lavish new lifestyle for herself and her husband. The deception inevitably unraveled when the jewelers, not receiving their payments, approached Marie Antoinette directly asking for settlement. The Queen, utterly bewildered, denied ever ordering the necklace or receiving it. The truth slowly, horrifyingly began to emerge. Louis XVI, furious at the insult to the Queen and the Crown, ordered a public investigation and arrests. Imagine the absolute shock that ripped through France. Rohan was arrested on Assumption Day 1785 in his full cardinal's robes, as he was about to celebrate Mass at Versailles, a public humiliation of the highest order. Lamotte, her husband Cagliostro, and Nicole d'Oliva were also apprehended. The king, in a catastrophic error of judgment, decided to bring the matter before the Parliament of Paris, rather than dealing with it in secret through royal prerogative. He believed that a public trial would vindicate his wife and restore the honor of the crown. It did the opposite. The trial became a public spectacle, a platform for anti-monarchical sentiment. You'd imagine the public outcry, the furious debates in the streets and cafes of Paris. Lamotte, though clearly guilty, played the victim, framing herself as a pawn in a conspiracy to discredit the Queen. Rohan, to save himself, claimed he was deceived by Lamotte, but always maintained he acted in good faith, believing he was pleasing the Queen. The public, already predisposed to believe the worst of Marie Antoinette, devoured every scandalous detail. The verdict was a disaster for the monarchy. Rohan was acquitted of fraud, though he was exiled from court, primarily because the Parlement disliked him and distrusted the royal authority. Lamotte was found guilty, branded with a V for volus, thief, on her shoulder, whipped and imprisoned. But the public verdict was clear. Marie Antoinette was guilty. They believed she had conspired with Lamotte, that she had ordered the necklace, perhaps even intending to pin the blame on Rohan. They saw it as proof of her insatiable greed, her moral corruption, and her indifference to the suffering of her people. The sins of the diamond necklace affair are numerous and profound. It was the sin of fraud and ambition by Lamotte, the sin of vanity and credulity by Rohan, but, more importantly, it was a profound political sin committed by Louis XVI, who, by making the trial public, allowed the scandal to permanently tarnish the Queen's reputation. It was a PR nightmare, a total failure of judgment that allowed a fabricated scandal to become a symbol of royal decadence and corruption. For you, in your modern age of rapid information and media manipulation, the diamond necklace affair is a chilling case study. It demonstrates how a compelling narrative, even if false, can become truth in the court of public opinion, especially when the target is already unpopular. It solidified Marie Antoinette's image as the frivolous, extravagant queen, utterly detached from the realities of her nation, reinforcing the notion that the monarchy was bankrupting France for its own selfish pleasures. This perceived sin of extravagance, even when she was innocent, pushed the French monarchy further down the path towards revolution, proving that sometimes appearances, however deceiving, can be more powerful than reality, and can ultimately be the spark that ignites a conflagration. You've witnessed the immense pressures and the devastating scandals that plagued Marie Antoinette as queen, culminating in the diamond necklace affair that irrevocably damaged her public image. Now let's explore her desperate search for respite, for a semblance of normalcy, away from the suffocating etiquette of Versailles. This is the story of the Petit Trianon, a small, intimate chateau and its surrounding hamlet, built for her by Louis XVI. For you, it represents a poignant paradox, a queen's yearning for a private life that ironically became another source of public outrage and reinforced her image as a frivolous, detached monarch. Imagine the contrast. Versailles is a sprawling public monument, a gilded cage where every royal act is a performance, every movement observed, every word dissected. Marie Antoinette, a naturally vivacious woman who felt stifled by this rigid protocol, yearned for escape. Her husband, Louis XVI, understood this. He loved her deeply, even if their intimacy was slow to develop. And in 1774, he gave her the Petit Trianon, a smaller, elegant chateau on the Versailles estate, granting her virtually absolute control over it. This was an unprecedented gift, a symbol of his affection and his desire to give her a sanctuary. At the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette declared that the rule of strict court etiquette would be suspended. Only those invited by the Queen herself were allowed entry.
Even the king had to seek permission to visit.
Imagine the sheer audacity, the revolutionary nature of this decree. In a court built on hierarchy and access, here, the Queen could be Marie Antoinette, not just the Queen. You'd feel the immense relief she must have experienced, the profound sense of liberation from the constant scrutiny that had plagued her since her arrival in France. She immediately began transforming the estate. She commissioned a picturesque Anglo-Chinese garden, a stark contrast to the formal French gardens of Versailles. Her most famous and controversial addition was the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's hamlet. This was a whimsical, idealized rustic village, complete with a dairy, a mill, a farmhouse, and thatched roof cottages designed to look authentically rural. Here, Marie Antoinette and her closest friends would dress as shepherdesses, milk cows, fish in the pond, and engage in idealized pastoral activities. You'd imagine the scenes: the Queen, dressed in a simple muslin gown, a revolutionary departure from stiff silks, perhaps with a straw hat, playing at being a milkmaid. For Marie Antoinette, this was a genuine attempt to find peace, to reconnect with nature, and to escape the unbearable artifice of court life. It was a form of innocent role-playing, a quiet rebellion against the expectations placed upon her. She found joy in the simplicity, the quiet, the freedom from formality. She could be herself, or at least a version of herself she longed to be, away from the relentless demands of her public role. You'd understand her yearning for this escape, her desire for personal space in a life that offered none. However, the sinful secret of the Petit Trianon and the hamlet was not in the Queen's intent, but in its perception. To the suffering French public, struggling with famine and crushing debt, the image of the Queen playing at being a peasant in an extravagantly built, fully functional and endlessly costly rustic village was an outrageous insult. Imagine the contrast. Real peasants were starving, their children ill, their lives a constant struggle for survival. And here was their Queen, surrounded by unprecedented luxury, indulging in a fantasy of poverty. The public saw not a queen seeking solace, but a frivolous, callous woman oblivious to the suffering of her people, spending colossal sums on a childish whim. The costs associated with the Petit Trianon were indeed enormous. The landscaping, the construction of the hamlet, the constant upkeep, and the lavish parties thrown there all added to the growing perception of royal extravagance. Rumors spread like wildfire, painting the hamlet as a place of licentious orgies and unchecked debauchery, further tainting the Queen's reputation. You'd feel the intense frustration of the public, their anger fueled by these exaggerated but powerful narratives. The Petit Trianon became a symbol of Marie Antoinette's detachment from reality. Her desire for privacy, for a simpler life, was fundamentally misunderstood and twisted by a public desperate for a scapegoat. Her refusal to adhere to court etiquette, her preference for a small circle of friends, were interpreted as haughtiness and disdain for the French nobility. The sins attributed to her were compounded by the very actions she took to escape the sins of courtly life itself. Her quest for authenticity was seen as an act of profound inauthenticity. For you, this is a tragic lesson in leadership and public perception. Marie Antoinette, though perhaps genuinely seeking a personal refuge, failed catastrophically to understand the optics of her actions. In a society racked by inequality, her attempts to create a private paradise, however innocent her intentions, were interpreted as a colossal failure of empathy. Her search for a normal life, ironically, pushed her further away from the realities of the vast majority of her subjects. The contrast between your modern understanding of mental health and stress relief and the historical judgment against Marie Antoinette is stark. In your world, seeking a retreat, a hobby, a personal space would be seen as a healthy coping mechanism. In her world, for a queen, it was a profound transgression, a betrayal of her public role, and a clear sign of her moral failings. The Petit Trianon, designed as her sanctuary, ultimately became another nail in the coffin of her public image, an enduring symbol of the fatal disconnect between the queen and her people. You would walk away from this tale with a sobering understanding of how even a monarch's personal yearnings can be weaponized in a volatile political climate, and how the sinful secrets often reside not just in explicit vice, but in the profound misunderstanding between a ruler and a nation on the brink of revolution. You've spent much time within the gilded walls of Versailles, witnessing the opulent lives, the political intrigues, and the sinful secrets of the French court. Now, let's abruptly yank you out of that glittering world. Let's remove the silk and the powder, the chandeliers, and the endless banquets. We're going to step outside the palace gates, away from the manicured gardens, and plunge you into the brutal, unrelenting reality of life for the vast majority of the French populace in the 17th and 18th centuries. For you, accustomed to modern comforts, social safety nets, and basic human rights, this will be a stark, chilling, and profoundly uncomfortable journey, a visceral confrontation with the true cost of royal extravagance. Imagine yourself not as a noble, but as a French peasant. Your home is not a luxurious apartment, but a cramped, often single-room cottage with a thatched roof and earthen floor. It's cold in winter, stifling in summer, and perpetually damp. The air inside is thick with the smell of smoke from a sputtering hearth, the lingering scent of stale food, and the omnipresent odor of unwashed bodies. You have no running water, no sanitation. Your bed is a straw mattress shared with several family members and often with insects. Privacy, as you understand it, is an alien concept. You'd feel the constant chill, the gnawing hunger, the pervasive discomfort that would be your daily companion from birth to death. Your life is a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor. From dawn until dusk, you toil in the fields, plowing, sowing, harvesting, often by hand or with rudimentary tools. The land might not even be yours. You are likely a tenant farmer, owing rent and a portion of your harvest to a lord you may never see. The sun beats down on your back, the rain soaks your clothes, the cold seeps into your bones. Your hands are calloused and cracked, your body perpetually aching. There are no weekends, no holidays, no sick days. If you don't work, you don't eat. You'd feel the bone-deep weariness, the constant exhaustion that would define your existence. But the harvest, even if good, is never truly yours. You are burdened by an oppressive weight of taxes and feudal dues. You pay the tile, land tax, to the king, the gabelle, salt tax, a particularly hated levy that forced everyone to buy a certain amount of expensive salt, and countless indirect taxes on goods. To your local lord you owe the cens, a land rent, the champart, a share of your harvest, and fees for using his mill, his oven, his wine press. To the church you pay the dîme, tithe, typically 1/10 of your produce. Imagine the frustration The bitter injustice of working so hard only to see the fruits of your labor siphoned away by multiple layers of authority, leaving you with barely enough to survive. You'd feel the simmering resentment, the profound sense of unfairness that would build up year after year, generation after generation. Hunger is not an abstract concept. It is a constant, terrifying companion. A bad harvest, a severe winter, a prolonged drought, or a hailstorm could mean starvation. You'd remember the lean years, the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, the cries of your children as they went hungry. You'd witness the emaciation, the hollow eyes, the desperate measures people would take, eating weeds, bark, anything to survive. Disease, fueled by malnutrition and unsanitary conditions, would sweep through your village, claiming children, the elderly, and the weakest. You'd feel the profound helplessness, the constant fear for your family's survival, a primal terror that modern societies rarely experience. Justice, as you understand it, barely exists. If you had a grievance, your local lord was often the judge, jury, and executioner. Royal justice was distant, expensive, and often corrupt.
If you were accused of a crime, your fate could be swift and brutal.
Imprisonment was harsh, often leading to death. Torture was a common practice. You'd know that a commoner's life was cheap, easily extinguished, while a nobleman, no matter his sins, rarely faced severe consequences. You'd feel the utter powerlessness, the knowledge that your voice counted for nothing, that your life was subject to the whims of those above you. The contrast between your life and the lives of the nobility at Versailles is not merely economic, it is a chasm of human experience. While you worry about feeding your children, they debate the merits of a new court fashion. While you suffer in a cold, damp hovel, they shiver in a magnificent yet draughty palace. While you pray for a good harvest, they gamble away entire estates on a single card game. This profound disconnect, this moral blindness, is arguably the greatest sinful secret of the French court. Their lavish lifestyle, the very existence of Versailles, was built on your suffering, on your back-breaking labor, and on your unfulfilled human potential. Education is a luxury you cannot afford. Most peasants are illiterate, their world confined to their village and the immediate region. News travels slowly, often distorted by rumor. The Enlightenment, with its ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, is a distant echo, though its radical notions would slowly begin to permeate even the most remote villages. You'd feel the weight of ignorance, the inability to truly understand the wider world, the sense of being trapped by circumstance. And yet, despite this crushing burden, life goes on. There are moments of joy, a wedding, a harvest festival, the birth of a child. There is the comfort of community, the strength of faith. But these fleeting moments are always overshadowed by the relentless struggle, the ever-present threat of hunger, disease,
and exploitation. As you step back from this visceral experience,
from the stench of poverty, the ache of hunger, and the chill of despair, you would carry with you a profound understanding. The sinful secrets of the French court were not just about personal moral failings of kings and queens, or the intrigues of ambitious nobles. They were, at their core, about a system of profound injustice, a moral bankruptcy that allowed immense wealth and privilege to coexist with unimaginable suffering. The silence of the commoner, the unseen suffering, was the greatest sin of all, a ticking time bomb that would ultimately explode, sweeping away the gilded world of Versailles and forever changing the course of history. You would return to your modern comforts with a newfound appreciation for the basic dignities and protections you take for granted, privileges that were brutally denied to the millions upon whose backs the French monarchy was built. You've just felt the crushing weight of the commoner's existence, the stark, brutal reality that lay beneath the gilded surface of Versailles. Now let's bring you back to the palace, but this time the air is no longer merely thick with perfume and ambition. It's heavy with a different scent, the acrid tang of fear, the crackle of escalating tension, and the unmistakable, terrifying whispers of impending revolution. The sinful secrets of the court, once confined to hidden chambers and private intrigues, are now laid bare, magnified by public outrage, amplified by the printing press, and weaponized by a populace that has finally had enough. For you, this is the story of a system unraveling, a slow-motion catastrophe where the mistakes of generations finally converge into an unstoppable, violent storm. Imagine the atmosphere in the 1780s. The king, Louis XVI, is well-meaning but indecisive. The queen, Marie Antoinette, is still reeling from scandals like the diamond necklace affair, her reputation in tatters. The French treasury is empty, exacerbated by lavish spending and the costly support of the American Revolution. Attempts at financial reform are consistently blocked by a self-serving aristocracy unwilling to give up its privileges. You'd feel the palpable sense of crisis, the desperation of ministers trying to plug a leaking dam with their bare hands, while the privileged classes continue to party. But this time, the discontent isn't just a silent gnawing in the guts of starving peasants. It's articulate, it's organized, and it's spreading like wildfire through the burgeoning public sphere. The printing press, once controlled by royal censors, is now a potent weapon. Pamphlets, often anonymous and fiercely critical of the monarchy, the queen, and the entire aristocratic system, are circulating by the thousands in Paris and beyond. Imagine these cheaply printed, crudely illustrated broadsides being passed from hand to hand in smoky cafes, read aloud in town squares, their words fueling a righteous indignation. They expose the sins of the court with brutal clarity, detailing the Queen's supposed extravagance, the King's perceived weakness, the moral corruption of the clergy, and the parasitic nature of the nobility. The ideas of the Enlightenment, once discussed in elite salons, have now seeped into the popular consciousness. Philosophers like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, with their radical notions of liberty, equality, and the social contract, have laid the intellectual groundwork for revolution. You'd hear snippets of these ideas in the markets, in the taverns, even among the lower ranks of the court, talk of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the tyranny of absolute monarchy. These are dangerous ideas for a system built on divine right and inherited privilege. The court, insulated in its gilded bubble, struggles to comprehend the depth of this popular anger. They dismiss the pamphlets as scurrilous lies, the cries of the starving as mere grumbling. They continue their lavish balls, their hunting parties, their private theatricals at the Petit Trianon, seemingly oblivious to the seismic shift occurring just outside their gates. You'd witness this profound denial, this tragic inability to adapt, to understand that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. The summoning of the Estates General in 1789 is meant to solve the financial crisis, but it quickly transforms into something far more radical. It's meant to represent the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, the Third Estate. But the Third Estate, empowered by Enlightenment ideas and frustrated by centuries of disenfranchisement, demands more power, more representation. You'd feel the electric tension in the air as these different classes clash, their interests diametrically opposed. The commoners, for the first time, have a collective voice, and they are using it with devastating effect. The royal family, particularly Marie Antoinette, becomes the focal point of public hatred. Every sinful secret of the court, real or imagined, is projected onto her. The rumors of her excessive spending, her gambling, her alleged affairs, her perceived disinterest in the welfare of the French people are amplified to a deafening roar. She is no longer merely l'Autrichienne. She is Madame Deficit, the Austrian tigress, a symbol of everything that is wrong with the corrupt monarchy. You'd feel the visceral hatred directed at her, the chilling realization that her life is now in grave danger. The economic crisis deepens. The price of bread, the staple food for most French people, skyrockets. Hunger turns to desperation, desperation to rage. In Paris, the streets become increasingly volatile. Orators harangue crowds calling for justice, for bread, for an end to aristocratic privilege. The king, hesitant and indecisive, vacillates between repression and concession, satisfying no one. His attempts to deploy troops only inflame the situation further. Then comes the storm. On July 14, 1789, the people of Paris, fearing royal repression and seeking arms, storm the Bastille, a medieval fortress and symbol of royal tyranny. This isn't just a riot, it's a symbolic act of defiance, a moment when the people take power into their own hands. You'd hear the roar of the crowd, the clang of muskets, the terrifying sounds of a society tearing itself apart. The fall of the Bastille is the point of no return. The royal family, still at Versailles, is initially unaware of the true significance of the event. When informed by the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, Louis XVI famously asks, "Is it a revolt?" The Duke replies, "No, sire, it is a revolution." You'd feel the chilling finality of that exchange, the moment of absolute irreversible shift. The gilded cage has been breached. The final, agonizing act of this segment is the Women's March on Versailles in October 1789. Thousands of Parisian women, desperate for bread, march to the palace, demanding that the king and queen return to Paris. They storm the palace, overwhelm the guards, and even attempt to reach Marie Antoinette's bedchamber. You'd feel the raw, untamed fury of the crowd, the primal hunger that drives them, the terrifying vulnerability of the monarchy. The royal family is forced to leave Versailles, escorted by the mob, their carriages surrounded by bayonets and pikes, carrying the severed heads of their guards. They are taken to Paris, effectively prisoners in their own capital. The sins here are no longer merely personal indiscretions or courtly intrigues. They are systemic. The sin of a bankrupt absolute monarchy, the sin of an aristocracy that refused to compromise, the sin of profound social inequality, and the sin of a royal family that lost touch with its people. The secrets are no longer hidden. They are public, screamed in the streets, printed in pamphlets, and used to justify the overthrow of an entire social order. You would stand at the precipice of this historical cataclysm, feeling the immense power of collective rage, the terrifying beauty of a people rising up against oppression. The glittering world of Versailles, which once seemed eternal, has shattered, swept away by the forces of history, and you would understand with chilling clarity that the sinful secrets of the French court, accumulated over centuries, had finally demanded their ultimate price. The revolution was not an accident. It was the inevitable, brutal reckoning for a monarchy that had, for too long, forgotten its people. You've traveled through centuries of the French court, from the dazzling, iron-fisted control of Louis XIV to the tragic collapse of Louis XVI's reign. You've breathed the scented, foul air of Versailles, witnessed the ruthless political games, felt the gnawing anxiety of courtiers, and glimpsed the dark underbelly of forbidden pleasures and deadly intrigues. You've even touched the raw, unseen suffering of the common people, the stark contrast that ultimately fueled the inferno of revolution. Now, as our journey through these sinful secrets concludes, let's bring you back, gently, to your own time, to your own comfortable spot, to reflect on the echoes of this distant, brutal past. As you sit there, perhaps still chilled by the stories of the cold palace or the terror of the commoner's hunger, take a moment to truly appreciate your modern comforts. Think of your clean, running water, your private bathroom, the simple act of choosing your own clothing without fear of social judgment. Imagine the quiet of your home, undisturbed by the constant chatter and scrutiny of 1,000 watchful eyes. These are not minor conveniences. They are profound freedoms, hard-won legacies of a history that challenged and ultimately shattered systems of absolute power and rigid hierarchy. You are enjoying the very luxuries, privacy, hygiene, autonomy, a voice that were either utterly alien or brutally suppressed for almost everyone in the world we just explored. The sinful secrets we unearthed, the hypocrisy of public piety masking private debauchery, the casual cruelty of a system that privileged birth over merit, the exploitation of women and the masses, the unchecked ambition that led to literal poisoning, and the profound indifference of rulers to the suffering of their people. These are not merely tales of a bygone era. They are deeply human narratives, reflections of desires, fears, and failings that, in different guises, continue to resonate even in your modern world. Consider the allure of power, the insatiable desire to climb, to influence, to stand closer to the center of authority. You see it in corporate boardrooms, in political campaigns, in the relentless pursuit of fame. The tools may have changed from whispered rumors to social media campaigns, but the underlying ambition, the willingness to cut corners or undermine rivals, remains strikingly similar. The Game of Thrones in many ways never truly ends. It merely changes its chessboard and its players. Think about the cult of personality. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was the ultimate brand, a meticulously crafted image of divine authority. In your world, you see it in the reverence given to celebrities, to influencers, to political leaders whose carefully curated images are consumed by millions. The hunger for spectacle, for charisma, for an individual to embody a collective dream or desire persists. But, as Louis XV and Marie Antoinette tragically demonstrated, when that carefully constructed image clashes with perceived reality, the fall can be swift and devastating. The moral compromises, the convenient blind spots, the hypocrisy. These are also echoes you might recognize. In any institution, in any society, there are often public pronouncements of virtue that stand in stark contrast to private realities. The human tendency to rationalize one's own desires, to ignore the inconvenient truths of others' suffering, to create bubbles of privilege and disconnect, is a timeless pattern. The French court was an extreme, opulent example of this, but the underlying psychological mechanisms are unsettlingly familiar. And the cost of detachment? Louis XV's indifference, Marie Antoinette's yearning for private escape. These speak to the profound danger of leaders losing touch with the lived realities of those they govern. In your democratic societies, leaders are held accountable, their actions scrutinized by an active press and an engaged citizenry. But the lesson remains: when power becomes too insulated, too detached, too oblivious to the struggles of the common person, resentment ferments, and the foundations of stability begin to crack. The revolution was not just about bread. It was about dignity, recognition, and the right to be seen and heard. As you pull your blanket tighter, let the images of Versailles, the dazzling gold, the flickering candles, the rustle of silks, but also the stench of unwashed bodies, the despair of the gambler, the glint of a poisoner's vial, settle in your mind. These sinful secrets are not just tales of moral corruption. They are cautionary echoes, reminders of the complexities of human nature, the intoxicating allure of power, and the profound, often brutal, consequences when that power goes unchecked. So as you drift off, perhaps you'll carry with you a new perspective, a deeper appreciation for the simple dignities of your own life, the freedoms you possess, and the systems that protect you from the arbitrary whims of an absolute monarch. The French court, in all its glittering, sinful splendor, was a world of unimaginable extremes, a crucial chapter in the human story. And understanding its shadows, its secrets, its very human failings, helps us better understand the light of our own present, and perhaps even shape a more just future. Good night.